This is Lynn Bobo, a 20-year-old girl from Tennessee who was on the brink of a new life. She was about to finish her studies and dedicate herself to the noble profession of nursing. It seemed like nothing could overshadow her future until one April day in 2011, she vanished without a trace. Her brother was the last person to see Holly alive. According to him, he witnessed a strange scene. Holly was talking to an unknown man in their home's garage. This stranger, whose face remains in the shadows to this day, grabbed the girl and forcibly took her to the nearest forest. I can only imagine the horror that gripped Holly at that moment. Despite a quick call to the police, it was too late. By the time law enforcement arrived at the scene, the perpetrator had already managed to disappear with his victim. A race against time began in which, unfortunately, the criminal proved to be more cunning. Holly, a native of the quiet town, was a true child of nature. Countless photos show her in camouflage together with her family as they explore the local forests and hills. Nature was her second home, but despite her love for outdoor activities, Holly was not a very sociable person. At her core, she was rather shy and reserved. But this quiet exterior hid an unwavering inner confidence. She knew exactly who she was and what she wanted out of life. Everyone asked themselves the question, what really happened to Holly on that fateful April morning, and will the truth ever be revealed? I will tell you all about it right now, but traditionally only to those wonderful and incredible people who right now will subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write any comment to promote this video. These 3 simple actions will help conscious people find and watch this video and realize what problems exist in society and what should always be paid attention to. Holly grew up in the small town of Darden, Tennessee, with a population of just over 3,000 residents. It was a quiet, cozy corner, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. An ideal place to raise children and enjoy a peaceful life. As a detective, I have seen many towns, but Darden immediately captured my heart with its simplicity and sincerity. Locals were proud that Darden was a middle-class stronghold. Crime here was at a record low, and the cost of living allowed even middle-income families to feel comfortable. All the ingredients for a happy life were in Darden: safety, tranquility, proximity to nature. No wonder Holly loved her hometown so much. But despite her devotion to Darden, Holly had ambitious plans for the future. She was studying at a college in neighboring Parsons at the University of Tennessee's Nursing Center. It was a small but cozy building where several hundred young and eager students like Holly diligently mastered the basics of medicine. Parsons, although larger than Darden, was also a fairly quiet town. But for students, everything they needed was here: quality education, a friendly atmosphere, and even a few shops where they could have fun after stressful classes. Holly felt like a fish in water here. By the way, what Holly valued most was the opportunity to escape from the noisy city life. Parsons was a quiet haven for her, where she could focus on her studies and her dreams. And although she enjoyed spending time with her family in Darden, Parsons gave her a sense of freedom and independence, so necessary for growing up. The short distance between Darden and Parsons allowed Holly to easily combine her studies and family life. She could devote time to classes without sacrificing warm family moments. It seemed like she had the perfect life: loving parents, close relationships with her brother, and a promising future. As an experienced detective, I have seen many examples of how crime can shake even the most peaceful towns. But it was hard to imagine anything bad in Darden and Parsons. But despite the apparent idyll, danger lurked very close. And when it finally struck, no one was ready. Not Holly's family, not the residents of Darden, not law enforcement. Holly's disappearance was a blow from which the town took a long time to recover. After all, if this could happen to Holly, a girl everyone knew and loved, then no one was safe. Now, looking back, it's easy to see the alarming signs. But then, in those carefree days, no one could have imagined that Holly's life was about to change forever. And with it, the lives of everyone who knew and loved her. On the fateful morning of April 13, 2011, nothing foreshadowed trouble. Holly woke up early around 4:30 to prepare for an important exam. She didn't know that this was the last normal morning of her life. The last hours of carefree existence before her world turned upside down. Around 7:30, Holly received a call from her boyfriend, Drew Scott. He had just returned from hunting turkeys in his grandparents' backyard. It was a usual morning for Drew, while for Holly it was to be a fateful one. None of them could have imagined the tragedy that was looming at the time. At that point, Holly's parents had already left for work, and her brother Clint was still sleeping in his room. The house was immersed in morning silence, which was about to be shattered by terrible events. Around 7:40, just 12 minutes after talking to Drew, Holly made her last call. She didn't know yet that these were her last minutes of freedom. From that moment on, all of Holly's calls and messages went unanswered. Drew, who was used to being in constant contact with his girlfriend, began to worry a lot. He felt that something was wrong, but he couldn't even imagine the scale of the tragedy. The alarm was heightened by reports from neighbors about screams coming from Holly's house. A young man who lived nearby with his parents heard the commotion and immediately called his mother, and she, in turn, decided to warn Holly's mother. No one could understand then that behind these screams was something much more terrible than an ordinary quarrel. As it turned out later, these calls proved to be fatal. If someone had immediately rushed to Holly's aid or called the police, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. But at that moment, no one could comprehend the magnitude of the danger. Every lost minute brought Holly closer to a terrible denouement. Listening to the details of this case from my colleagues, I couldn't get rid of the thought, what if someone had reacted earlier? What if someone had listened to their instincts and intervened? Maybe they wouldn't be mourning the lost life of a young girl. But the past cannot be changed. All that remains is to learn from bitter lessons and do everything to prevent such tragedies from happening again. I don't know if Holly could have been saved because, analyzing all the events, I feel like the criminal carefully planned everything. But I do know that her story shocked not only me, but also my colleagues, which is actually rare. Meanwhile, Holly's brother, Clint, had just woken up from the barking and growling of the family dogs. Alarmed, he jumped up to see what was going on. Running to the window, Clint saw a strange scene. Holly was talking to some stranger near the family garage. This scene immediately aroused his suspicions. Looking closer, Clint noticed that the stranger was oddly similar to Drew, Holly's boyfriend. At first, he even thought it was really Drew, but something about the situation seemed wrong. They were walking back and forth, clearly arguing about something, but Clint couldn't make out a single word. The only thing he could understand was that Holly was incredibly upset. Her voice sounded broken, but she hardly said anything. Instead, the man was talking almost the entire time, his voice tense and angry. The only thing Clint could make out was how Holly firmly said no at one point and then began asking why. While Clint was watching this scene, his mother called him. He recounted to her in detail everything he saw. Clint speculated that Holly and Drew were probably breaking up, and it was all happening in their garage. He had no idea that his sister was in danger. How bitterly he later regretted this mistake. But then Holly's mother said something that made Clint's blood run cold. It wasn't Drew. She ordered Clint to shoot the stranger immediately. Clint was shocked. He still couldn't clearly see the man, but he was sure it was Drew. How could anyone expect him to shoot his sister's boyfriend? If only Clint had realized earlier that his sister was in trouble. If only he had acted more decisively, maybe things would have turned out differently. But at that moment, he simply couldn't believe that Holly was in danger in their own home, at the hands of a person he mistook for her boyfriend. I feel sorry for how often we don't notice obvious signs of danger, because they seem too incredible, too scary to be true. We dismiss the alarming bells, hoping for the best until it's too late. Of course, it's easy to judge in hindsight. But I'm sure Clint curses himself every day for that fatal mistake. He will have to live with this burden for the rest of his life. Clint, still not believing his ears, asked his mother in despair, "Do you really want me to shoot Drew?" This question seemed to only enrage her even more. She simply hung up, leaving Clint completely bewildered, and dialed 911 instead. As it turned out later, this call was a fatal mistake. Holly's mother was calling from her work number, so she was connected to the police department of another county. Every lost minute gave the perpetrator more time to cover his tracks and escape with Holly. This bureaucratic confusion cost them precious time. While Clint was trying to figure out what was happening, events were unfolding at lightning speed. He ran to the window again, but it was too late. The stranger and Holly had already gotten into the car and disappeared in the direction of the nearest forest. Clint felt his heart sink. He knew that something had gone terribly wrong. It was only at this moment that Clint finally realized that the man he saw could not be Drew. He was much taller and more muscular. But due to the distance and in the semi-darkness, Clint still couldn't get a good look at him. He tried to call Holly, although he knew the chances of an answer were slim. And indeed, she did not answer. Meanwhile, Clint's mother, realizing her mistake with the call, contacted him again. She admitted that she had failed to reach the right police department and begged Clint to do it himself. Without wasting a second, Clint grabbed a shotgun and ran out into the yard. And then his gaze fell on something that made his blood run cold. Red spots were visible on the ground near the garage. Spots that were almost certainly Holly's blood. At that moment, the full horror of the situation finally gripped Clint. He realized that his sister was in terrible danger, and every second counted. With trembling hands, he dialed 911 and described the situation as clearly as possible. But even with all the desire, it took the police about 10 minutes to get to the remote Bobo family home. And in those 10 minutes, Holly and her abductor were long gone. Frankly, I can't help but think about how many opportunities to stop this tragedy were lost due to unfortunate misunderstandings and fatal coincidences. If only Clint had realized the danger earlier, if only the call had immediately reached the right department, if only the police had arrived even a few minutes earlier, maybe things would have turned out differently. I'll tell you how it is, we need to learn to trust our instincts, act quickly and decisively when we hear a cry for help. And no less important, we must ensure that our emergency response system works like clockwork, without delays and failures. Because believe me, when life is at stake, every second is precious. As soon as Holly was declared missing, the police launched a large-scale search. They combed every corner of the city and its environs, hoping to find at least some trace that would lead them to the girl or her abductor. But unfortunately, all their efforts were in vain. It seemed as if the earth had opened up and swallowed Holly without a trace. In a desperate attempt to find a clue, the police requested records of Holly's phone conversations. They hoped they could track her location using GPS data from her mobile phone. And indeed, this yielded the first fruits. They quickly determined that immediately after the abduction, Holly's phone was heading towards the woods near her house, exactly where, according to Clint, the car with Holly and her abductor had gone. Further traces led to Interstate 40, where Holly's phone stopped briefly. And then someone made a call from her number, and the phone started moving again, this time in the opposite direction, as if someone was deliberately trying to confuse the trail. I immediately suspected that this was an attempt by the kidnapper to divert suspicion and throw up smokescreens. An investigative team was immediately dispatched to the place where the last call was made. They hoped to find Holly there, or at least some evidence that would indicate her whereabouts, but they were bitterly disappointed. After a thorough search, they returned empty-handed, no trace of Holly, no clue as to where she might have disappeared. It was a dead end that threatened the investigation from the very beginning. In this situation, the police decided to rely on Clint's testimony, the only person who had caught a glimpse of the kidnapper. The young man described him as a tall, stocky man, about 6 feet tall and weighing under 200 pounds. Dark hair, a baseball cap, mossy oak camouflage, that's all Clint remembered. No special marks, no clues that could lead to the criminal's trail. Only a deep, loud voice, so loud that Clint could hear it even from a distance. The description provided by Clint seemed quite detailed at first glance. But as it turned out, in towns like Parsons, where hunting and outdoor recreation were commonplace, practically every second man fit this description. Height about 6 feet, weight under 200 pounds, dark hair, a baseball cap, and mossy oak camouflage within a 30-mile radius of the town, there were plenty of them. This negated any attempt to compile an accurate portrait of the suspect. But the police were not going to give up. They sent out search parties throughout Parsons and the surrounding area, hoping to stumble upon some evidence or witnesses that could help the investigation, and their efforts were not in vain. Very soon, Holly's personal belongings began to be found all over the town. Here and there, someone would come across her breakfast box, a receipt with her name on it, a postcard from the college where she was studying, as if someone had deliberately scattered them to mock the police and the girl's relatives. Moreover, according to some reports, even Holly's cell phone and her SIM card were found in the town, although other sources claimed that these items, as well as the college postcard, were found in the woods near the Bobo home. In any case, these findings only confirmed the worst fears. Holly had not simply disappeared, she had become the victim of a brutal crime. The first person to come under suspicion was a local resident named Terry Britt, and no wonder Terry already had a criminal record and perfectly fit the description given by Clint. The investigators took him very seriously. They wiretapped his house, checked every corner of his possessions. But for better or worse, they found nothing suspicious. In the end, for lack of evidence, Britt had to be released. Days, weeks, months passed. And then years. It seemed that the Holly Bobo case had reached an impasse. No progress, no new leads. The girl's family still hoped for a miracle, but with each passing day, that hope faded. And then suddenly, in the fall of 2014, the unexpected happened. A group of mushroom pickers scouring the woods near Interstate 40 stumbled upon something terrifying. They immediately called the police, and then, unfortunately, only a few years later, the worst fears were confirmed. Among the autumn leaves and branches lay skeletal remains. Examination showed that these were the remains of Holly Bobo, who had disappeared 3 years earlier. I can't even imagine what Holly's family felt when they heard this news. 3 years of uncertainty, 3 years of hope, and then such a terrible denouement. It's something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And although this discovery finally provided an answer to the question of what happened to Holly, it also meant that this investigation was no longer just a disappearance. Now it was a murder investigation. Of course, as soon as Holly's remains were found, the case took on a new scope. It would seem that the police had a new lead, a new chance to stumble upon the killer's trail. But as is often the case, it turned out to be not so simple. The place where the remains were found was popular with mushroom pickers and hunters. Hundreds of people could have passed through it over the course of 3 years, trampling potential evidence. Moreover, the wooded area and weather conditions had taken their toll. Most of the traces and prints that could have led to the perpetrator were hopelessly lost. It was another dead end that threatened to bury the truth about Holly's death forever. The place where Holly's remains were found turned out to be a remote patch of forest about 20 miles from her hometown of Darden. At first glance, it seemed an odd choice after all. There were plenty of secluded, deserted places around Darden. Why did the killer take us so far? Perhaps he was afraid that someone might accidentally stumble upon the body somewhere closer to town. When investigators reached out to the owner of this plot, he was not surprised. According to him, despite the remoteness and lack of trails, this place was popular with mushroom pickers. They often wandered these woods without special permission, so it's not surprising that it was the mushroom pickers who eventually stumbled upon Holly's remains. If not for chance, the truth about her fate might never have come to light. When forensic experts began to examine the find site, a gruesome picture unfolded before them. Holly's bones were scattered over a fairly large area, as if someone or something had deliberately scattered them. But the most terrifying thing was something else. Judging by the hole in the skull, the girl had been killed by a shot to the head, executed in cold blood. It would seem that the discovery of the remains should have been a breakthrough in the investigation. But as it turned out, the police already had a prime suspect in mind and had been hunting him for at least 6 months prior to this. What's most strange is that this man was just one of 6 persons of interest in the Holly Bobo case. Yes, you heard that right, 6. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in this convoluted story. The first arrest in the Holly case took place back in March 2014, several months before her body was found. 3 men, Zach Adams, his brother Dylan, and their friend Jason, were detained on suspicion of involvement in the girl's disappearance. At that time, the investigation did not yet have a body, but there was already evidence of violent actions against Holly. Moreover, the deeper the investigators dug, the more horrifying the picture became. It turned out that before the murder, Holly had been subjected to assault. It's hard to even imagine the horror this young girl had to endure in the last hours of her life. What kind of monsters could commit such an atrocity? But the shock of this revelation was quickly replaced by an even greater shock. After the trio of main suspects were brought in for questioning, police arrested 2 more individuals on suspicion that they had helped hide Holly's body after the murder. It appeared to be an entire criminal gang, and each of them played their own gruesome role in this tragedy. You know, in my years with the police, I've seen a lot of horrible things. But the story of Holly Bobo struck even me with its senseless cruelty, the audacity of the criminals who buried the body in the woods like some kind of garbage, and then led the investigation by the nose for months. It was something out of the most terrifying crime dramas, and at the same time entirely real. But the shocking twist didn't end there. As it later turned out, there was another suspect in this case, but he committed suicide before the police could interrogate him. Such an ominous detail which only added mystery to this whole story. Who is this man? What role did he play in Holly's disappearance? And why did he choose to take his own life rather than answer the investigators' questions? Even more intriguing was the fact that the police never disclosed why these 6 men ended up on the list of suspects. Perhaps it had to do with their past, some long-ago offenses or ties to the criminal world. Or perhaps the investigators simply didn't want to reveal all their cards so as not to harm the investigation. In any case, the details remain shrouded in mystery. The only thing that leaked to the press was that one of the suspects, Dylan Adams, Zach's brother, had previously had problems with the law. Back in 2014, he had been held liable for illegal possession of weapons. Not the best characteristic for a person suspected of involvement in a brutal murder. But of course, this alone was not enough to prove his guilt. During the interrogation, Dylan told something very interesting. He claimed that on the day of Holly's disappearance, he saw her alive at his brother Zach's house. Moreover, according to documents that later became the basis for a search,
Dylan had allegedly witnessed Holly being held at Zach's house on that very April 13, 2011, the day of her disappearance. According to Dylan, he came to his brother's house that day to borrow a truck. But when he went inside, he saw Holly. She was sitting in a chair in the living room and looked very bad. And then something truly horrific happened. Zach allegedly confessed to Dylan that he raped a girl and recorded it all on video. Of course, such a confession should have been a breakthrough in the investigation. But there were two problems. First, the video recording mentioned was never found, as if it had never existed. Second, Dylan himself later recounted his words. He began to claim that the investigators had pressured him and demanded that he slandered his brother. And to be honest, it's not hard to believe some of the details of Dylan's story really didn't fit well with the other evidence in the case. The only thing that confirmed his words was the clothes that Zach was allegedly wearing that day. Dylan mentioned that his brother was in camouflage, and this matched the description given by the witness, Holly's brother Clint. The same description of a tall man in mossy oak camouflage who was talking to Holly in the garage shortly before her disappearance. It seemed that there really was some connection here. Overall, the situation was shaping up to be confusing and ambiguous. On the one hand, the police had serious suspicions about Zach Adams and his inner circle. Something clearly connected these people to Holly's disappearance and murder. But on the other hand, not all the confessions and testimonies seemed reliable. Some might be holding something back, while others might be adding extra details under pressure from the investigation. Unraveling this tangle and getting to the heart of the matter was oh so difficult. I'll be honest, at this stage of the investigation, my own head was spinning. So many versions, so many potential suspects, and yet no direct and unambiguous evidence. It would take a lot of effort and professionalism not to get lost in this maze, to sift the truth from the fiction, and finally bring the perpetrators to justice. And here we come to one of the most mysterious and disturbing details in this whole story. The same video that Dylan mentioned, the video that supposedly captured Zach Adams raping Holly Bobo. Of course, this immediately raised many questions and doubts. Was Dylan telling the truth? Or maybe he made up this story to divert suspicion from himself. Or maybe the video did exist, but someone made sure it disappeared forever. However, even without this video evidence, Dylan's testimony proved weighty enough for the police to take action. Based on his words, 3 main suspects in the case were arrested: Zach Adams, Jason Autry, and Shane Austin. 3 individuals who, according to the investigation, were directly involved in Holly's disappearance and murder. But the most ominous thing about all this was the fact that one of the suspects, Shane Austin, had already taken his own life by that point. He committed suicide before the police could bring official charges against him. Of course, this immediately raised new questions and suspicions. Could Shane not bear the burden of guilt? Or maybe he knew something he shouldn't have, and someone made sure he stayed silent forever. Be that as it may, now that Shane was dead, all eyes were on the other 2 suspects, Zach Adams and Jason Autry. It was their testimony that would now determine whether the investigation would finally be able to piece together a complete picture of what happened to Holly. And then there was another unexpected twist. It seems the police found a way to put pressure on Jason. They made it clear to him. If he didn't cooperate with the investigation, he risked spending the rest of his life behind bars. And I must say, this tactic worked. Soon Jason began to give testimony that seriously implicated Zach Adams. He offered to make a deal, information in exchange for a lighter sentence. And the police seemed ready to make that compromise. It was this moment when Jason began cooperating with the investigation that became a turning point in the entire case. Finally, there was a real chance to find out the truth about what happened to Holly Bobo. It seemed that just a little more, and all the pieces of this gruesome puzzle would fall into place. But as it turned out, not everyone was thrilled with this turn of events. The lawyer for the late Shane Austin reacted particularly sharply. A month before the trial began, he came out with a loud statement, accusing the police of bias and unprofessionalism. According to him, the investigators had no real evidence against Shane, at all just some theories, speculation, and rumors. Moreover, the lawyer claimed that the police had simply harassed Shane, threatened him, made him believe that he was going to be accused of a crime he did not commit. And allegedly, unable to withstand this pressure, Shane decided to take his own life. In fact, Shane's relatives, through their lawyer, accused the police of driving him to suicide. Of course, these statements made quite a stir. Although no official lawsuits were filed against the police, everyone understood that it was only a matter of time. The investigators' reputation was at stake, and if it turned out that they had indeed resorted to illegal methods of pressure, it could call into question the entire course of the investigation. I'll be frank, when I heard about these accusations, I felt quite a bit of unease. Of course, I trusted my colleagues and wanted to believe that they had acted strictly within the law. But I know all too well how dirty this business can be, especially when it comes to high-profile cases that attract the attention of the entire country. Sometimes, in the pursuit of results, people can cross the line of what is permissible. And if something like that happened in the case of Shane Austin, it could have very serious consequences. However, no matter what the lawyer said, the fact remained. Shane Austin was dead, and 2 other suspects were in custody. And now everything depended on what Zach Adams and Jason Autry would tell. Finally, in September 2017, Zach Adams stood trial on charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder of Holly Bobo. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for 6 long years. The moment when it seemed that justice might finally be served. But as it turned out, this was only the beginning of new shocking revelations. Zach's defense immediately put forward an unexpected version. They claimed that Clint, Holly's brother, was actually acquainted with the suspects. Moreover, according to them, on the day of Holly's disappearance, Zach, Dylan, and their friend Jason came to the Bobo house, not at all to kidnap the girl. Allegedly, they intended to teach Clint himself to make methamphetamine. Jason, who by that time had already agreed to testify against Zach in exchange for a deal with the prosecution, told even more amazing things. Allegedly, during this lesson, Holly accidentally found out what her brother was doing and was shocked and frightened. So much so that she ran out of the house screaming the same screams that the neighbors heard and which prompted them to call the police. If you believe this version, it turns out that Clint knew a lot more from the beginning than he was saying. He knew what kind of people Zach, Dylan, and Jason were and what they were capable of. That's why he was so reluctant to intervene when he realized Holly was in trouble, because he was afraid for his own skin. And then, according to Jason, this is what happened. When Holly tried to escape, the suspects grabbed her and forcibly shoved her into the car. They took her to some abandoned barn, where they took turns roughing her and then killed her. All so that she would keep quiet about their dark dealings. Of course, this is a very convenient version for Jason, which partially relieves him of responsibility. But there is one problem: Clint categorically denies that anything like that happened in their house that day. And there is no physical evidence to support Jason's words either. So why should the jury believe one criminal accusing another? Doesn't this sound like the usual rumors and slander that thugs resort to in order to save their own skin? And that's not all. If you compare Jason's testimony with what Dylan Adams told, you can see a lot of discrepancies and contradictions. It seems that each of them is telling their own version of events, and with a lot of blank spots and inconsistencies.
Therefore, from everything I've heard, I can only draw one more or less reliable conclusion. Most likely, after the kidnapping, Holly was taken to the same barn that Jason mentioned, and there they did something terrible to her. And then when Zach, Dylan, and perhaps Jason himself realized that she was still alive, they decided to get rid of the witness. And Zach, as the ringleader of this gang, took on the role of executioner. He shot Holly in the back of the head, rolled her body up in a carpet, and drove it in his pickup truck to the woods near the highway. And then he threw the gun into a pond somewhere nearby so that the police would never find it. Of course, there is no direct evidence of this. There are only the words of one killer against another. But even that, it seems, was enough for the jury. Because when the trial finally took place in September 2017, Zach Adams was found guilty on all counts of kidnapping, rape, and murder. For the totality of crimes, he was given life without the right to parole. His brother Dylan, who allegedly only helped cover up the tracks, got 50 years of which he will actually serve at least 35. As for Jason, who handed over his accomplices, he got off scot-free. The prosecutors dropped all charges against him supposedly. He did not take a direct part in the murder. However, I'm not sure that this is fair. After all, if even half of what these scumbags told about each other is true, then it turns out that they should all be behind bars. Every single one of them, because each of them, to one degree or another, was involved in this atrocity. But unfortunately, justice is not always perfect. And it's not always the one who committed the most serious crime who gets the most severe punishment. Sometimes those who are more guilty turn out to be more cunning than others and know how to divert suspicion from themselves in time by pointing the finger at someone else. Therefore, to be honest, I cannot say with any certainty that the final point has been put in the Holly Bobo case. There are too many dark spots and unclear moments in it, too tangled a web of lies, understatement, and mutual accusations. I do not exclude that there is something more behind all this something that we still do not understand. These subhumans who didn't give a damn about someone else's life, who felt like having some fun and decided to play with someone else's fate like a toy. Cowards who valued their own skin above all else and therefore decided to permanently shut the mouth of the poor girl who simply found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes, maybe some of them managed to escape the punishment they deserved. Maybe we will never know the whole truth about those events. But one thing I know for sure, the story of Holly Bobo should not remain just one of many criminal cases. It should be a reminder for all of us. A reminder of how fragile human life is. About how easy it is to take it away and how nothing can be done later to correct what has been done. But most importantly, a reminder that evil and indifference exist alongside us. They are lurking very close behind familiar faces, and so we must always be on guard to protect those we love. Holly Bobo deserved to live a long and happy life, but it was taken from her, and although we could not save her, we have no right to forget her. Every day of my work investigating another case, I think about her and about how much more evil there is in the world that needs to be fought. Many of us are familiar with youthful mistakes and doubts when choosing a life path. Something similar happened to the heroine of today's story, who could not define her own feelings. She was too young to realize how risky love triangles can be. Unfortunately, the girl did not have time to grasp this. Kaylee Mundy was only 19 years old, and she was a second-year student at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas, USA. She was in a romantic relationship with a 22-year-old man named Mark Howon. At the same time, Kaylee found herself faced with a difficult choice, as in addition to Mark, she continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jet Burcham. Kaylee had previously dated him, and even after meeting Mark, she wavered between these two young men for a long time. You can't even imagine how fatal this reckless love triangle turned out to be for her. On October 29, 2017, Kaylee, along with her boyfriend Mark Howon, attended the annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the lovers drank alcohol, smoked marijuana, and then mutually decided to make love in the car. After that, the girl unexpectedly passed out. Mark, noticing that she was not breathing, quickly put her in the car and rushed her to the nearest hospital. It seemed nothing unusual, right? But no, my dears, everything turned out to be extremely tragic. If you're interested in learning about this horrific incident, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. This will greatly support me as an author. The doctors made every effort, using various methods and equipment to save Kaylee's life. Unfortunately, this was unsuccessful. The doctors were forced to declare the death of the 19-year-old cheerleader Kaylee Mundy due to the injuries sustained, and the girl had many injuries. When Kaylee's mother first saw her daughter in the hospital, it even seemed to her that she had been hit by a train or a truck, or that she had fallen from a plane, so mutilated was the girl's body. There was practically no uninjured spot on her. When the victim was brought to the hospital, her condition was extremely serious. The doctors performed artificial respiration at least 7 times, and they managed to start her heart. However, each time after that, it unfortunately stopped. Kaylee fell into a deep coma, so initially the doctors connected her to life support systems. The fight for the girl's life lasted 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Kaylee's brain was dead. The doctors had to inform her parents that there was no hope for recovery. For this reason, the decision was made to disconnect the girl from the artificial ventilation system. Unfortunately, this tragic decision was the most difficult thing Kaylee's parents could experience in their lives, but despite this, her relatives insisted that her last wish must be fulfilled. Kaylee had always wanted her organs to be donated to save other people's lives in case of such a tragedy. Her mother was constantly in the ward and until the very end did not believe in the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true. According to the forensic expert's conclusion, the cause of death was a traumatic brain injury. The deceased was found to have a fractured skull and elbow bone, resulting from blows with a blunt object. In addition, the cheerleader's body was so mutilated that her relatives simply refused to believe that a human being could have done such a thing. It rather seemed as though the girl had been in some terrible accident or was killed by a maniac. You know, in my practice I've seen a lot of bloody cases, but looking at the photos from the hospital, my blood just runs cold. Unfortunately, I can't show them to you due to YouTube's policy. This is a very sad case because at the time of the tragedy, Kaylee had just turned 19. She was a second-year student at Trinity University, where she studied public relations. Kaylee was a bright, popular, and respected girl in the university's female community. She was a cheerleader, easily made friends, was sociable, and naturally fit into any company people were drawn to her. According to Kaylee's best friend, the girl was interested not only in studying, but also in building her personal life and enjoyed entertainment. Her whole life was ahead of her. Immediately after entering the university, Kaylee fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jet Burcham. He became her first and only truly strong feeling that she could not forget. The young people met in their first year. The guy was a talented athlete, and they immediately felt an attraction. The girl called him her dream and was incredibly proud of their relationship. However, in the opinion of the deceased's mother, it was a typical teenage love. The couple occasionally had arguments, and their feelings would flare up and die down with new intensity. By the second year, Kaylee was already convinced that Jet shared her plans for the future to get married and have children. But then the girl began to realize that the guy took life too lightly and did not think about the future prospects. When Kaylee became aware of this, she decided to move on. It was at this time that the girl met Mark Howon. He did not study at Trinity University, but was visiting friends there. An immediate mutual attraction arose between Kaylee and Mark. They got along wonderfully and started dating. But the girl was unable to completely break off contact with Jet. Thus, she effectively found herself in a relationship with two guys at the same time. This became her fatal mistake. Moreover, both young men knew about Kaylee's affairs. It seemed as though the girl had arranged some kind of competition or race where she intended to choose the better of them. But for obvious reasons, both guys were categorically against Kaylee's experiments and tried in every way to get her to make a final choice. But the young people did not have time to resolve this conflict. Literally a month after the second suitor appeared, the girl ended up in the hospital with injuries incompatible with life. He brought her there in his car around 10:30 p.m. on October 29, 2017. While the doctors were fighting for the victim's life, the police were already talking to 22-year-old Mark. For this, they took him to the most secluded place they could find in the hospital, the chapel there. According to Mark, the couple spent a weekend at the music festival in San Antonio, where they drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. The police found out that such a recreation scenario was a common thing for them. Further, as Mark reported, approximately between 5 and 6 p.m. they went for a ride in his Mercedes. During this trip, an argument flared up between the lovers. Kaylee confessed that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jet. Mark apparently tried to convince her to break up with her ex-boyfriend and stop any communication with his company. Eventually, he managed to calm Kaylee down, and she agreed to think about his words. Later, Mark continued. The couple stopped at a deserted parking lot near a gas station, where they engaged in intimate relations. According to the guy, their sex was rough. He claimed that he strangled the girl, slapped her in the face, but assured that Kaylee liked it. She enjoyed intense sensations. Despite numerous attempts by the police to latch onto the facts stated by Mark, he steadfastly stood his ground, claiming that everything happened by mutual consent. Was it really like that? Unfortunately, it turned out not to be so simple. Events unfolded not according to the usual scenario. As Mark reported, after sex, he and Kaylee talked for about 5 more minutes, and then the girl started complaining of a headache. But the guy did not attach much importance to it, attributing it to an excess of alcohol. When a few seconds later, Kaylee suddenly passed out and started snoring, Mark still did not sound the alarm. He allegedly decided to take the girl to his apartment in Houston because he thought she had just fallen asleep under the influence of fatigue, alcohol, and drugs. At some point, Kaylee stopped snoring and stopped showing any signs of life at all. That's when the young man became worried. Mark tried to feel for a pulse, but it seemed to him that there was none, and he did not notice any breathing. Only after that did the guy rush to the hospital. Mark claimed to be extremely worried, concerned about Kaylee's condition, and hurried to try to save her life. The detectives who began investigating this incident had no doubt that the girl's horrific body condition was the result of a vicious attack. They interrogated Mark several times, but there was nothing to latch onto. The only inconsistency that immediately caught the eye was the indication of where the car was located. At first, Mark reported that he and Kaylee had spent time at a gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind it. But in general, these details did not compromise him in any way. The guy did not confess to the murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him. So Mark was released without being charged, although of course he remained the prime suspect. After all, no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been brutally abused before her death. The situation changed radically only after 3 months when the full report of the forensic expert arrived. In the opinion of the specialist, Kaylee died as a result of blunt facial and head trauma, so everything that happened was reclassified as intentional murder. On this basis, on February 28, 2018, Mark was arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, even then, the young man did not admit his guilt, and later he was even released on bail until the start of the trial. It would seem obvious the girl was last with Mark, so he should be held accountable. But the deeper the police delved into the details of the investigation, the more thoroughly they studied the identity of the suspect and the circumstances of the victim's life, the more they revealed a whole tangle of tragic mistakes, fatal coincidences, and misunderstandings that ultimately led Kaylee to the forensic experts' table. Mark's relatives and friends immediately hired a lawyer for him to defend the innocent young man in their opinion. The lawyer was convinced that the young man was being unfairly held accountable. The lawyer believed that the charges were the result of the negligence and bias of the investigation. In his view, Mark was not involved in the assault, and the cause of the girl's injuries could have been an ordinary fall at the music festival or two vigorous efforts by doctors during attempts to save her life. The police's work was significantly complicated by the fact that the officers were unable to find anyone who witnessed what happened, despite the fact that everything took place at a crowded concert. The suspect's lawyer insisted that his client could not have committed such a brutal crime because his behavior did not generally correspond to that of a typical murderer. Instead of trying to cover up the evidence and dispose of the body, Mark himself took the victim to the hospital in an attempt to save her. Of course, the defense tried in every way to create as positive an image of their client as possible. Unfortunately, as the prosecution later discovered, an incredibly experienced and influential lawyer was working with the suspect. It was not until December 2019, a full 2 years after the tragedy, that Mark stood trial for the murder of Kaylee. From the prosecution's point of view, on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, effectively kidnapping her from the music festival. Then he drove her to a deserted parking lot behind a gas station. It was there that Mark, enraged by the argument and jealousy of the other guy, brutally abused Kaylee, beating her, raping her, until the girl experienced a brain hemorrhage that caused irreversible consequences. When the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man became scared and tried to rectify the situation by getting to the hospital. He really hoped that the doctors would be able to save Kaylee. However, in the opinion of the lawyer, this version of the accusation was flawed from beginning to end, starting with the moment of kidnapping and ending with the beatings and rape. The defender appealed to the fact that the prosecution did not have a single direct witness who could confirm the kidnapping, who saw the girl being forcibly placed in the car and taken away from the festival venue. The defense put forward the assumption that the active attempts to save Kaylee's life and the intensive resuscitation measures by the doctors could have been the cause of the bruises and other injuries on her body. It was known that the doctors performed indirect heart massage on the girl at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute Mark's version was dead, and although the lawyer's version about the infliction of injuries by doctors sounded extremely doubtful, the prosecution had to rule out all unlikely scenarios claimed by the defense, and for this, witnesses were needed who could shed light on at least some part of the events of that tragic evening. First of all, the investigators interviewed the paramedics who were on duty at the ambulance and were the first to start rescuing the student. Their crew was standing in the parking lot near the emergency room, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, a car stopped behind them with a wild screech of tires. The driver, waving his arms in panic, called for help. It was Mark Howon. He quickly led the paramedics to his car and showed them the unconscious Kaylee. Mark begged them to save the girl, who had allegedly stopped breathing. When the doctors looked into the car, their vigilance only grew. Naked Kaylee was lying in the car. Her pants and t-shirt were on the floor. The girl showed no signs of life, and her body was covered in bruises. Even on the inside of her thighs, there were characteristic finger imprints. Kaylee was barely breathing, and her pulse was faint, so the doctors immediately began resuscitation measures, artificial respiration, indirect heart massage. A detailed examination of the victim was out of the question at the time her life was at stake. These testimonies of the doctors completely refuted Mark's lie that the bruises appeared on Kaylee only after she arrived at the hospital, allegedly from 2 intense resuscitation attempts. After all, everyone who saw the girl during her arrival at the hospital unanimously stated that hematomas had already covered her entire body at that time. Moreover, several witnesses drew attention to Mark's strange appearance. His fists, according to those present, were dirty and red, as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time before bringing Kaylee to the hospital. It later turned out that Mark was quite muscular and athletic, and he took steroids to increase his muscle mass. And this excessive preoccupation with anabolic steroids, according to his acquaintances, began to provoke sudden mood swings, outbursts of aggression, and uncontrolled fits of rage in the young man. Such a steroid effect could explain the brutal assault on Kaylee that evening. The girl may have inadvertently provoked her boyfriend's anger with a careless word or gesture. At first, Mark cooperated quite willingly with the investigation, even allowing his car to be inspected without a warrant. In the car, detectives found a gun and drugs. The defense skillfully used these circumstances to the benefit of their client. The lawyer argued that no one guilty of a serious crime would be so openly cooperative with the police. However, the prosecution quickly saw through this cunning move by the suspect. In their opinion, Mark was deliberately pretending to be innocent and assisting the investigation in every way to deflect any suspicion from himself. The police continued to pressure the guy, and eventually it paid off. They managed to find out that Mark had previously shown aggression towards Kaylee. A few weeks before the tragedy, one such conflict ended with a police call. At that time, Kaylee simply fled from her enraged boyfriend, who nearly beat her in the dorm. When the law enforcement officers arrived in response to the call, they saw that the room was turned upside down, broken furniture, a smashed laptop, scattered belongings, clothes in the trees outside the window. According to neighbors, Mark caused a terrible mess, but Kaylee then withdrew her complaint and asked not to disclose the details. Kaylee's friends said that after that incident, the couple's relationship seemed to have ended. Kaylee did not want to even talk to Mark and ignored his calls, but later the former lovers reconciled. During the court hearing, the prosecution demonstrated the couple's personal correspondence. The context of the messages made it clear that Mark reacted very painfully to any hints about a possible breakup. For example, in one of the photos, he was holding a gun to his temple and threatening to kill himself if Kaylee did not call him. Thus, Kaylee found herself drawn into an extremely dangerous and morbid love triangle. The girl did not dare to completely break up with Mark, fearing that he really might commit suicide, and at the same time, she could not give up her feelings for the other guy, her ex-boyfriend Jet. Kaylee herself repeatedly confessed to her friends that she was in love with both of them, which made it so difficult for her to make a choice. At the trial, the prosecution argued that on the eve of the tragedy, in October 2017, Kaylee finally decided to break this oppressive bond. It was about this that she informed Jet during the festival. The girl wanted to break up with Mark right after the concert, and until then, she stayed close to him to protect herself from possible aggression in a crowded place. However, as soon as the lovers found themselves alone, the jealous Mark, according to the prosecution's version, forcibly dragged the girl into the car and drove her to a deserted place, where he brutally assaulted her. Unfortunately, the key witness in this case was supposed to be Jet Burcham, Kaylee's other boyfriend. And indeed, during the first court hearing, it was thanks to his testimony that the prosecution had grounds to accuse Mark of kidnapping, rape, and murder. But very quickly, the defense managed to discredit Jet's testimony. As it turned out, he was not actually an eyewitness to the kidnapping. Jet did not see firsthand how Mark forcibly put Kaylee in his car, although he initially claimed that he had personally witnessed this. This all came to light when the lawyer started cornering the guy, asking him why he did not rush to the girl's aid if he had witnessed the violence. In reality, Kaylee and Mark had disappeared from Jet's sight even before that moment. He could not have witnessed their departure, and he was relaying second-hand information, although he was unable to name those people. All of this gave the defense grounds to accuse Jet of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Their main witness now looked extremely unreliable, which undermined confidence in his words. In addition, during the trial, photos of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Jet Burcham's mobile phone. This gave grounds to suspect the guy of drug abuse and involvement in drug distribution. It later turned out that at the time of Kaylee's death, her ex-boyfriend was on probation. He had previously been arrested for selling marijuana, and among the youth of San Antonio, Jet had a reputation as a well-known dealer. The defense conducted a harsh cross-examination, and at some point, Burcham began to evade answering questions, citing his constitutional rights. For a guy who had cooperated with law enforcement and received immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for his testimony, such behavior seemed extremely strange. It seemed as though he was afraid of exposing himself in some dubious dealings that were unrelated to Kaylee's case. Additionally, Mark's lawyer managed to find out that Jet had previous legal problems. Shortly before the incident with Kaylee, he had been expelled from the university for harassing another student who had filed a police report. At that time, Jet was able to settle the conflict by promising to voluntarily leave the educational institution, so the defense openly pressured the jurors, portraying Jet as a real scoundrel, a drug dealer, harasser, and liar. Who would believe such a witness? But the prosecution did not give up. In order to dispel any doubts about the causes of Kaylee's death, the prosecution brought in several independent experts. The forensic experts came to an unambiguous conclusion: the head trauma that caused the massive brain hemorrhage and ultimately the girl's death could in no way have been sustained as a result of her short stay in the hospital, as the defense had insisted. The lawyer's version that Kaylee had allegedly fallen and hit her head after being hospitalized sounded completely absurd. The girl had lost consciousness even before arriving at the clinic, so all the efforts of the doctors were aimed precisely at trying to revive her. So it was highly unlikely that they would have allowed someone to strike the patient so hard that she sustained a fatal traumatic brain injury. However, several experts brought in by the defense suggested that some of the bruises on the victim's body could have appeared as a result of her preparation for organ donation, a procedure that Kaylee herself had insisted on while still alive. Based on data about the nature and location of the injuries, forensic experts used 3D modeling to recreate the circumstances of the attack on the girl. These materials clearly demonstrated to the jurors that Kaylee's death was undoubtedly the result of a brutal beating, not an accident or medical negligence. The results of the toxicological examination were also a significant argument for the prosecution. The analysis of Kaylee's blood showed a high content of psychoactive substances that increased blood pressure and, consequently, the risk of internal bleeding and rupture of blood vessels. Therefore, Mark's defenders appealed to this fact, saying that with such a cocktail in the body, even a minor head injury could have provoked a fatal brain hemorrhage, which is what happened to the girl. However, the prosecution insisted that this was a case of intentional murder. After all, neither an accidental fall nor a medical error could explain the broken nose, split lip, bruises on the neck, and other characteristic injuries that eloquently testified to the girl's brutal beating. Eventually, after intense and lengthy debates between the parties, the jurors retired to the deliberation room to render a verdict. Just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. An unexpected witness contacted the lawyer, claiming that he had seen Kaylee's condition during her hospitalization. It was a duty nurse from the emergency room where the girl ended up. He assured them that when Kaylee was first brought in, there were no bruises on her body. In his opinion, that the hematomas could have arisen from internal bleeding due to prolonged cardiac arrests and measures taken to prepare the body for organ removal. Such testimony could have completely cleared Mark Howon of the charges, but as the judge explained to the lawyer at this stage, it was no longer possible to involve new witnesses. The jury's deliberations lasted more than 10 hours. For 2 days, they were unable to reach a consensus. The court was unable to satisfy the thirst for justice of the deceased girl's relatives. The jurors proved unable to render a unanimous verdict regarding the defendant's guilt. As a result, the court was forced to declare the previous trial improper and schedule a retrial. Despite this interim result, both sides stated that they were ready to continue defending their positions. The defense planned to seek a complete review of the case, including due to Jet Bertram's dishonest testimony and the appearance of a new witness. As for Kaylee Mundy's parents, despite everything, they had no doubts about Mark's guilt. They were determined to continue seeking to hold their daughter's abuser accountable, and very soon their hopes were fulfilled. The prosecution refiled charges against Mark Howon. In June 2023, a new trial began. This time, it was held behind closed doors without access for the press or outsiders. So many details remained unknown to the general public. Initially, in 2018, the young man faced life in prison. But during the retrial, the qualification of the crime and the measure of punishment were somewhat mitigated. Now Mark was charged with assault under aggravating circumstances, which carried a sentence of up to 20 years in prison. At this stage, the prosecution brought in a new expert, a specialist in domestic violence. He vividly depicted Mark's psychological portrait to the jurors as a classic abuser, a jealous owner who sought by any means to cut off Kaylee from all contact with the outside world, intimidated her, humiliated her, threatened her, and eventually could not restrain himself and crippled the girl in a fit of rage. In the expert's opinion, the 19-year-old Kaylee, due to her young age and inexperience, simply did not realize who she was dealing with and what danger she was in. As in the previous trial, a heated discussion about the nature of Kaylee's injuries unfolded in the courtroom. The defense was still unable to involve the new witness in the case, that same nurse who allegedly saw the girl's condition before the bruises appeared. Therefore, the prosecution's version turned out to be more convincing. Eventually, despite all the objections and attempts to play on the jurors' sympathies, Mark lost. He was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum term of 20 years in prison. Such is the sad and instructive story of Kaylee Mundy. A very young, inexperienced girl, blinded by love, failed to notice that her chosen one was a dangerous and unpredictable type. The one who swore to love and protect her turned out to be a real monster, and it cost Kaylee her life. Let this tragedy serve as a warning to all of us. Be cautious and careful in relationships. Do not ignore warning signs. Remember, if someone truly loves you, they will never express their feelings through rudeness, control, threats, or blackmail. These are signs of an unhealthy relationship that you need to get out of immediately. Unfortunately, Kaylee and her relatives did not attach importance to these red flags. The girl believed that she could tame her chosen one's evil temper and appealed to his common sense. But someone who is used to pressuring and intimidating rarely stops on their own. That is why victims of violence should seek help as soon as possible. Nowadays, in the USA, as in many other countries, there is an entire system to protect and support victims of domestic abuse. Crisis centers, hotlines, community organizations operate. The police, courts, and social services are all called upon to protect the vulnerable and prevent such tragedies. The central coast of New South Wales in Australia conceals a place with a grim reputation. Snapper Point, also known as the Deadly Cliffs. Despite being a popular tourist attraction, especially among fishing enthusiasts, this location is notorious for its steep, jagged cliffs. It's not uncommon for people to fall from these slopes straight into the turbulent ocean or get swept away by sudden waves. In recent years, at least 16 tourists have lost their lives in this area. However, as practice shows, it's not always just a blind chance or the whims of nature that cause these deaths. This story is about one such case. On April 24th, 2016, around 10:30 in the morning, several visiting fishermen were going about their business near Snapper Point. Suddenly, some of them, looking down from the cliffs, noticed a strange object beating against the waves. It quickly became clear that it was a body wrapped in black plastic, another victim of the treacherous deadly cliffs. One of the witnesses immediately reported the gruesome find to the police. Soon, a rescue helicopter arrived at the scene to retrieve the body, which was lying face down. But from the first glance, the specialist realized that this was no mere accident. The discovered body belonged to a young girl and had over 30 stab wounds. Particularly deep blows were inflicted on the neck, and there were traces on the hands and wrists indicating desperate attempts to defend herself. Unfortunately, the victim's clothing was never found, which significantly complicated the process of identifying her. The primary task for the police was to establish the identity of the deceased, and only then reconstruct the chain of events that led the girl to the medical examiner's table. But recognizing her proved to be difficult. There were no distinctive features or characteristic details of appearance. The expert determined that death occurred as a result of a brutal stabbing, and the defensive wounds on the hands indicated that the girl fought for her life until the very end. The fact that the body was found naked suggested a probable rape, but it was impossible to confirm or refute this version. The water washed away all potential evidence. To help identify the victim, law enforcement officers created a computer reconstruction of her appearance and published it online, dubbing the deceased Snapper Point Jane Doe. The girl had Asian facial features, looked to be 20 to 35 years old, was of average build, about 5 feet 7 inches tall, with dark chestnut shoulder-length hair. The condition of the body suggested that it had been in the water for a relatively short time. Questioning fishermen and other potential witnesses yielded no results. No one saw anyone throw a dead girl from the cliffs into the water. The police began a large-scale check of all recently missing persons in the region, both local residents and tourists. Special attention was paid to those who might have lost contact with loved ones, friends, or girlfriends. At the same time, an active search was underway among foreigners who had recently arrived in Australia. And so, quite quickly, people responded who noticed a striking resemblance between the mysterious victim and a Chinese student who had come to Australia on an exchange 4 years ago. They immediately reported this to the police. The very next Friday after the body was discovered, the detectives working on the case were able to establish the identity of the deceased. She turned out to be 25-year-old Michelle Leng, who had gone missing at the time of her death. As it turned out, Michelle lived in the suburb of Campsie, in Sydney, about 100 kilometers from the place where her mutilated body was found. And here's a chilling coincidence. Just a year before her death, the girl took a photo on the very cliff from which her dead body was later thrown. In the picture,
Michelle posed against the backdrop of water and cliffs, as if anticipating her own fate. When the media picked up this news, rumors began to spread that the girl had come to this place to meet a guy she had met online, and this date turned out to be fatal for her. Journalists spun the version that an unknown suitor literally lured Michelle to her death, but the police promptly worked out this version and refuted it. A detailed analysis of the girl's correspondence and messengers showed that she did not meet anyone and did not plan any meetings. So who and why did someone need to cut short the life of a young student? To answer this question, investigators had to delve deeper into the details of Michelle's life and surroundings. The nature of the crime, extreme brutality, and a large number of stab wounds indicated a personal motive. The police did not abandon hope of finding the killer's trail. It was established that Michelle Leng was born in China in 1991 and had been very close to her mother, Mei Jiang, all her life. Michelle Leng's life path was full of trials from a young age. A heavy blow to the family was the death of the girl's father during a devastating earthquake that occurred in her hometown in China. This tragedy not only took the life of the closest person, but also put the family in a difficult financial situation. However, despite all the hardships, mother and daughter became even more united in the face of difficulties. Their relationship became stronger, and their emotional bond became unbreakable. Michelle acutely felt responsible for the fate of her mother and understood that without her support, they were unlikely to survive. It was then, in search of a better life and opportunities to help her family, that the girl made the decision to radically change her life. She began to consider options for moving to another country, where she could find a promising job and get a quality education. And her choice fell on distant Australia. In 2011, full of hope and expectations, Michelle Leng arrived in Sydney, the largest city on the green continent. The girl was sure that it was here, in this metropolis of opportunities, that she would be able to realize her dreams and ambitions. And at first it seemed that fate was smiling upon her. Michelle adapted to the new realities fairly quickly, made new friends, and settled her life. She became a student at the University of Technology, Sydney, choosing economics and business as her specialty. In parallel with her studies, the girl found a job in order to be able to financially support her mother. It is worth noting that Michelle, without hesitation, sent her first salary to her mother in China. And from then on, every month she transferred money to her family, because deep in her heart, she understood how important her help was for them. In Australia, Michelle was lucky with housing. She did not have to rent an apartment, because her relatives themselves suggested that the girl should live with them in an apartment complex in the Sydney suburb of Campsie. There she lived with her 48-year-old aunt, her teenage son from a previous marriage, and her 28-year-old uncle, Derek Barrett, who was Michelle's second cousin and had been married to her aunt since 2012. For the girl's mother, this arrangement was a great relief because she knew that her daughter was under the supervision of relatives. This gave her peace of mind and confidence that nothing bad would happen to Michelle, and the girl herself enjoyed the company of close relatives. She had a warm, trusting relationship with her aunt and uncle. They seemed to Michelle to be decent, reliable people with whom one could not only share a roof over their heads, but also share the most intimate things. In addition, living with family allowed the girl to send more money to her mother, because it was possible to significantly save on housing rent. To better understand what kind of person Michelle was, investigators thoroughly studied her social media pages. There they searched for the smallest details, seemingly insignificant facts that could shed light on the identity of the deceased and, most importantly, lead to the trail of the killer. Law enforcement officers scrupulously analyzed the girl's posts, comments, likes, and photos. They checked recent calls and messages to understand who Michelle had been communicating with recently, what plans and intentions she had. This work was painstaking but extremely necessary. From the profiles on social networks, a picture emerged of a happy life of a young girl, filled with bright moments. Michelle often shared positive emotions and life-affirming thoughts with friends, loved to philosophize on topics that excited her soul. Among the publications, there were many selfies with friends,
against the backdrop of picturesque Australian landscapes. A special place was occupied by culinary masterpieces, which Michelle loved to show off so much. The girl adored cooking and sharing the results of her efforts on the web. It seemed that Michelle lived a tasty life in every sense of the word. Together with her friends, she often visited cafes and restaurants, tried new dishes, and studied the intricacies of local cuisine. Another passion of hers was animals, nature, and beaches. Photos from the picturesque corners of Australia appeared on the girl's pages from time to time. However, despite the richness of the newsfeed, the detectives could not find any hint of any suspicious acquaintances or dangerous connections. Then the investigators decided to talk to Michelle's closest circle, her friends and housemates. From them, it became known that the girl last got in touch on April 21st, 2016. Then she told her friends that she was planning a trip to the mall for shopping. Around noon, Michelle got on a train and went about her business. Later, the police obtained footage from surveillance cameras at the shopping center. They clearly showed the girl strolling between the rows of stores, trying things on, and buying new clothes in different departments. Her entire route through the mall was traced in detail, up to the moment when Michelle boarded the return train to Campsie. But what happened to the girl next remained a mystery. After all, there were no cameras along the way from the station to the house where Michelle lived. The last clue was that the girl logged into her media platform one more time after returning, but then her online activity stopped. Most likely, it was at that moment that something terrible happened to her. It was also strange that Michelle disappeared on Thursday, and already on Sunday, her mutilated body was found tens of kilometers from home, on the cliffs at Snapper Point. And the first to fall under suspicion were her housemates, her aunt with her husband and their son. The woman confessed to the police that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was in another city on business, so she did not even know whether Michelle had returned from shopping. But her husband, the deceased's uncle Derek Barrett, allegedly spent the whole evening at home. According to him, they had dinner together and then he went to bed. When he woke up in the morning, Michelle was already gone. The man assumed that his niece, like many girls her age, was having fun somewhere with friends, maybe even stayed overnight with someone. So at first, no one attached much importance to this. But when the girl did not show up at home on Saturday, Derek became worried. He began to write messages to Michelle, but in response, silence. The girl's mother, who was used to communicating with her daughter every day, was no less worried. Usually they talked a lot on the phone, but this time, Michelle seemed to have vanished into thin air. The aunt, returning home on Sunday, decided to look into her niece's room, and two things alerted her. Firstly, all of Michelle's things were in their places. It seemed that the girl was not going to go anywhere for a long time. And secondly, perfect cleanliness reigned in the room, as if Michelle had put things in order before something. And this was also very strange. The aunt and uncle, shocked by the suspicious circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, decided to contact the police. Their statement was received almost simultaneously with the message from the girl's friends, who actively disseminated information about her disappearance on the web. Thanks to Michelle's wide circle of acquaintances, the news of her disappearance spread like lightning across the internet and became public knowledge. The publication on the Chinese website Weibo turned out to be especially resonant. It helped to link the unidentified body found on the cliffs with the missing student. Detectives, having processed all available information about Michelle, came to the conclusion that the girl had no obvious ill-wishers. In addition, she was quite smart and savvy to stand up for herself if necessary. Cheerful and sociable, Michelle was unlikely to become a victim of a targeted murder. So the police suggested that it could have been an attack by some maniac operating in the area. However, no other similar crimes were recorded in the area. While Michelle's killer was freely roaming at large, the public was increasingly worried about their own safety and expressed dissatisfaction with the actions of law enforcement officers. It seemed that the investigation had reached a dead end. Considering all possible versions, the investigators did not rule out racist motives. After all, the victim was an Asian girl. All students of the appropriate origin were warned about the potential danger. Until the criminal was at large, none of them could feel safe. Society demanded that the police solve the murder and arrest the suspect as soon as possible. Michelle's grief-stricken mother arrived in Australia to meet with the relatives with whom her daughter lived until her death. The woman gave several interviews to the press in which she promised to make every effort to find the dangerous criminal. She was full of determination and put a lot of pressure on the police. From her, journalists learned that Michelle's grandmother could not withstand the news of her granddaughter's death and died of a heart attack. Thus, the killer took the lives of two family members at once. First of all, the investigators thoroughly checked the alibis of Michelle's closest circle. Her aunt had reliable confirmation that on the day of her niece's disappearance, she was on a business trip in a small town south of Sydney. This was evidenced by several witnesses, as well as tickets for transport and surveillance camera recordings. The woman herself was very hard going through the tragedy, blaming herself for not protecting Michelle. In her opinion, if she had not left home on that ill-fated day, then perhaps she could have prevented the disaster and saved her niece's life. The deceased's cousin, who lived with Michelle, her aunt, and his stepfather, also had an alibi. On the day of the girl's disappearance, he was engaged in everyday affairs, went to school, met with friends. Unlike Uncle Derek, the boy admitted that he did not see his sister on Thursday. Derek himself claimed that he spent the whole day at the computer. Being an IT specialist, the man supposedly worked hard on urgent projects that he had to complete by Monday. Michelle's cousin confirmed that his uncle really did not leave the computer then, but the boy could vouch for only about 3 hours spent with Derek in the apartment. Subsequently, the teenager made a shocking confession to the investigation. In general, neither Derek nor his stepson had a reliable alibi, so the police bombarded them with questions. After the first interrogation, Derek suddenly changed his testimony. It turned out that in fact, he left the house and met with some girl while his wife was away. This detail immediately attracted the attention of investigators. When asked why he did not tell about this immediately, the man referred to problems with drug addiction. Allegedly, due to the use of psychotropic substances, he has memory lapses, so he remembers the events of that day very vaguely. Such a confession sharply contrasted with the previous image of a decent family man that Derek was trying to create, and he could not provide the contacts of the girl with whom he allegedly met, so no one believed this version. Then Derek changed his testimony again. Now he stated that he was simply afraid to admit to cheating so as not to lose his wife if she found out about everything. This story seemed extremely dubious to the detectives. In addition, they noticed discrepancies in the testimony of Derek and his stepson, so the investigators' suspicions focused on the figure of Michelle's stepfather. To shed light on this dark story, the police decided to find out more about Derek Barrett and study the information from his mobile phone. By tracking the geolocation, law enforcement officers found that literally half an hour before the discovery of Michelle's body, the suspect's phone lit up 10 kilometers from Snapper Point. After reviewing the footage from surveillance cameras, investigators recorded how Derek refueled his car at a gas station near the crime scene. There, he also bought some drinks, paying with a bank card. The surveillance camera footage at the gas station clearly captured Derek Barrett, leaving no doubt about his presence in the area. So the detectives decided to ask what the suspect was doing so close to where Michelle's body was found shortly before its discovery. The man explained his presence at Snapper Point by visiting relatives. As it later turned out, Derek knew these places very well, as he was born and raised nearby. Moreover, a year ago, it was he who took Michelle to Snapper Point, where the girl even managed to take several photos against the backdrop of picturesque cliffs. However, such a coincidence seemed extremely dubious to the investigators, although they understood that it would not be easy to prove Derek's involvement in the crime. However, intuition persistently suggested to the cops that it was worth digging deeper in the direction of Barrett. So they obtained permission for a more detailed study of the contents of his mobile phone, hoping to find at least some clues that would link the suspect with the victim. And their efforts were not in vain.
Thanks to special programs, experts were able to restore a lot of deleted photos and videos that shocked seasoned police officers. In many frames, Michelle was completely naked and, it seems, did not even suspect that she was being filmed secretly. The girl carelessly slept or took a shower while Derek voyeuristically recorded her on camera. But the most chilling discovery were the clips in which the unfortunate Michelle lay on the bed tied up, with a gag in her mouth. Her gaze, full of despair and pleas for salvation, left no doubt. The girl became a victim of brutal violence against her will. This evidence from Derek's phone actually confirmed his guilt in the death of his niece. The collected materials were more than enough to consider Barrett not just the main suspect, but actually Michelle's killer. So on April 30th, Derek was arrested and taken into custody. However, the man immediately began to deny any involvement in the crime. The defendant's lawyer petitioned for his client's release on bail, but the defense's argument sounded unconvincing. Derek himself, through his attorney, expressed genuine surprise at the suspicions and arrest. Despite this, his wife, the aunt of the deceased Michelle, immediately filed for divorce. The woman was stunned by what had been happening within the walls of her house right under her nose. How could she have failed to notice all these warning signs earlier? She and her son immediately cut off all relations with Derek. Investigators determined that the photos of Michelle bound and gagged were taken on the day of her disappearance. Thus, the girl simply had no chance to tell anyone about the violence she had endured. Derek had personally documented his horrific crime against his defenseless niece. On his phone, earlier recordings were also found where he abused Michelle in a somewhat milder form. The girl probably did not realize the full danger, which is why she remained silent about her uncle's perversions. The collected evidence allowed investigators to reconstruct the picture of what happened on that fateful day of April 21st, 2016. When Michelle returned home, Derek snuck into her room and forcibly made her undress. Then he tied the girl up and gagged her. Recording all of this on camera, the pervert hit his victim. Soon after, Michelle's cousin, her aunt's son, returned home. The boy reported that for almost the entire time he was in the apartment, he did not see his stepfather but only heard some sounds. Apparently, water was constantly running in the shower, and Derek wasn't coming out for some reason. This seemed suspicious to the teenager, so he even became a bit worried. He approached the bathroom door and asked his stepfather if everything was all right. Hearing an affirmative response, the boy calmed down somewhat. Still, it was strange that Derek had been in the shower for almost 3 hours straight. During all this time, the man only opened the door once to ask his stepson to hand him some shampoo he had supposedly forgotten in the room. At the same time, Derek did not allow the boy to enter. Michelle's cousin sensed something was wrong but didn't dare to argue with his stepfather. At that moment, the teenager had no idea that he had narrowly missed witnessing the violence and that he could have saved his sister if he had insisted. The boy had no idea that Michelle was at home all this time. After all, judging by everything, she was tied up in her room upstairs. Shortly after her cousin left for a walk with friends, the unfortunate girl met her death at the hands of the perverted sadist. Derek managed to conceal the exact course of events and circumstances of the murder. The man claimed that due to drug use, he suffered from amnesia, so he simply didn't remember the details. It is only known that after the killing, Michelle's body ended up in the trunk of Derek's car. On April 23rd, the day after the murder, surveillance cameras on a neighboring house recorded the suspect taking out the trash from his home 4 times. Most likely, this was Derek's attempt to get rid of blood traces in the room. Then the man took the body to Sniper Point, the place where Michelle's mutilated remains were later discovered. Recordings from other surveillance cameras confirm that around 7 in the morning on April 24th, Derek's car entered the territory of Lake Manmora National Park. Just a few hours later, the girl's body was found by fishermen at the foot of the cliffs. The collected evidence was quite sufficient to prove Derek Barrett's guilt. The only chance for the defendant to avoid responsibility could have been declaring him insane. This is what the man's defense insisted on, using his claimed amnesia as an argument. However,
The conclusions of the psychiatric examination were disappointing for Derek. The doctors did not find any deviations or disorders in him that could have affected his awareness of his own actions. This meant that the man was fully capable of standing trial and answering for his actions. So, after consulting with his lawyer, Derek Barrett decided to plead guilty to all charges, hoping to mitigate his sentence this way. During the trial, he tearfully apologized several times to those present, especially to his victim's mother. However, even in the dock, Derek continued to insist that drug problems had led to lapses in his memory. During the court hearing, Derek Barrett repeatedly stated that the events of that fateful day were forever etched in his memory, not allowing him to sleep peacefully at night. The man claimed that he was tormented by nightmares from which he would wake up in tears. The accused even expressed remorse for his actions, assuring that he sincerely regretted the consequences of his deeds. However, Derek continued to insist that on the day of the murder, he was under the strong influence of narcotics, which caused him to be unaware of his actions and unable to recall the details of what had happened. While in prison, he even wrote a letter to his victim's mother, May, in which he begged for forgiveness. In his message, Derek apologized 1,000 times for what he had done, assuring that he deeply regretted the crime committed. But despite all his pleas, the court found Barrett guilty of first-degree murder and a whole series of other serious crimes. The incredible cruelty and perverted nature of the sexual violence Michelle endured became aggravating circumstances in the sentencing. Consequently, Derek was sentenced to 46 years in prison. According to Australian law, he will have the right to apply for parole after serving 34 years of this term. However, the story of Michelle Leng's suffering did not end there. In 2019, a fateful event occurred that shed light on the full scale of abuse the 25-year-old student from China endured before her horrific death. It happened when Michelle's aunt came to visit her elderly mother, who lived in Strathfield, another Sydney suburb. The girl's grandmother suffered from dementia, so her daughter had to visit the sick woman often. During one of these visits, the elderly lady was tightly clutching a small object in her hands. When her daughter asked to see what she had, the woman handed her a USB flash drive. Michelle's mother wondered what it was and what information it contained. Unfortunately, the grandmother couldn't answer these questions. She thought she was holding some kind of toy, so Michelle's aunt took the flash drive with her. Upon arriving home, the woman decided out of curiosity to see what might be on it. She inserted the drive into her computer and froze in horror at seeing its contents. The aunt immediately contacted the police, handing over the terrible find to law enforcement. The flash drive contained 13 photographs and 9 videos, with a total duration of over an hour. All these materials vividly demonstrated the horrific scale of abuse that poor Michelle endured in the last hours of her life. The video showed Derek bursting into the girl's room, brutally tossing her around like a rag doll, after which he repeatedly read her. Michelle's screams and pleas to stop the abuse seemed only to fuel her executioner's sadistic inclinations. Derek's face was frozen in a mask of perverted pleasure, and it didn't look at all like the man was under the influence of drugs, as he tried to prove in court. No, it seemed he was simply reveling in his power over the defenseless victim and deriving sick satisfaction from the very process of violence. But it still remains a mystery how the flash drive with these horrifying video evidence ended up with Michelle's grandmother. The old woman had no connection to either Derek or his victim. She lived quite far from Campsie, and she couldn't explain the origin of the USB drive herself due to progressive dementia. Eventually, the court was forced to review the charges against Derek Barrett in light of the newly discovered circumstances. He was charged with 9 additional counts related to sex crimes. This increased his prison term by 20 years, to 66, and the period after which Barrett can apply for parole increased to 36.5 years. The relatives of the deceased girl insisted that her killer should be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In their opinion, the terrible cruelty and perverted nature of the crime against poor Michelle could not have any other verdict. The judge took into account the appeal of the victim's loved ones, but noted that from a legal standpoint, life imprisonment was not possible in this case. So Derek Barrett will have the right to file his first petition for parole no earlier than 2052. But even this term seems too merciful, given the suffering that Michelle and her loved ones endured at his hands. After all, the girl came from her home to distant Australia not to become prey to a pervert who turned out to be a real wolf in sheep's clothing. Michelle was simply trying to help her mother and ease the financial burden on her family by agreeing to live with relatives and save on rent. The unfortunate victim silently endured abuse for 4 long years, hoping that one day it would finally stop. Unfortunately, instead of rescue, she was met with a tragic and premature death at the hands of her sadistic uncle. The tragic story of Michelle Lang is a bitter lesson for all of us. It reminds us how important it is to be vigilant and careful, even when it seems there is no danger. For sometimes evil hides where we least expect to see it. First and foremost, this story underscores the importance of open dialogue in the family. If Michelle had felt she could safely tell someone about what was happening, perhaps the tragedy could have been avoided. So creating an atmosphere of trust and mutual understanding between loved ones is the first step to preventing such situations. Also, this terrible story teaches us not to ignore warning signs. Perhaps if Michelle's relatives had been more attentive to changes in her behavior, they could have raised the alarm in time. So if you notice that something incomprehensible is happening with your loved ones, don't be afraid to reveal it and offer your help. Women and girls should be especially careful. Unfortunately, they most often become victims of domestic violence and perverted encroachments. So it's so important not to be silent, not to be ashamed, and not to endure abuse. If you feel something is wrong, immediately seek protection from relatives or contact law enforcement. Let Michelle's death not be in vain. Let's make her story a warning to all of us. Let's be more sensitive to our loved ones, more attentive to alarming bells, and always ready to come to the aid of those who need it. Christine Johnson, like many little girls, dreamed of a Hollywood star's life from childhood being beautiful, wealthy, and famous. She grew up in a loving family, had a happy childhood, and ambitious plans for the future. Christine's desire to become famous came true, but unfortunately not due to her talents, but because of the cruelty of her killer, and the details will shock you because her body was found with a torn-off ear. Born in 1981 in Santa Clara, California, Christine soon moved with her parents, Teresa and Kirk Johnson, to the small town of Saugatuck in Michigan. It was a cozy and picturesque place with a population of less than 1,000 people, where an atmosphere of peace and security prevailed. Crime here was extremely low, so locals didn't even lock their doors, not fearing criminals. Everyone in the community knew each other. Christine grew up along with her brother Derek, who was a few years older, in a family that seemed friendly and happy at first glance. However, the family idyll was shattered when the parents decided to divorce. Despite this, they maintained a good relationship for the sake of the children. According to the custody plan, Christine and Derek alternately lived with their mom and dad. Due to such circumstances, the girl got involved in household chores early and started helping her mother at the age of 12, including with the family budget. Striving for financial independence, Christine tried to get any job so as not to ask her parents for money. Meanwhile, her brother went to serve in the army and then decided to become a career military man. While studying in high school, Christine, having become independent, took her life into her own hands. Intelligence and natural beauty helped her in this. The girl was cheerful, fun, and an interesting conversationalist. She looked great thanks to an active and healthy lifestyle. Relatives, admiring Christine's beauty, advised her to conquer Hollywood. The girl got the most pleasure from sailing, surfing, and other water activities that she enjoyed when visiting her grandmother in California. However, after returning to Michigan, Christine missed her favorite hobbies and needed time to adjust to a different way of life. Here she became passionate about theater, being a member of a small acting group. In winter, she worked part-time as a waitress in a local cafe. Thanks to her friendliness, politeness, and sociability, Christine became a real find for the owner of the establishment, attracting more and more visitors. Christine increasingly thought about leaving the small town of Saugatuck. The measured life of the province did not appeal to her. The girl was convinced that she deserved something more than just serving food in a cafe. Christine saw no serious prospects for herself in this town. After graduating from high school in 1999, she finally gained enough freedom to start building her own life and path to success. Having thought over her situation, Christine decided to go in search of herself. The girl traveled to different cities, worked there, and tried her hand at various fields of activity. Eventually, in 2000, she chose California, which she loved so much, as her place of residence. This state attracted her with its wonderful climate and much wider opportunities for realizing her potential. At first, Christine moved in with her grandmother, who lived in the small resort town of Santa Maria with a population of 100,000 people. Despite being close to her favorite entertainment, the girl first focused on solving important issues. First of all, she started looking for a job, because providing for herself was very important to her. Christine got a job as a system administrator in the city's electric power company. Then she focused on her education and decided to enter the University of California. The educational institution was located a 40-minute drive from her grandmother's house. Christine successfully passed the entrance tests and bought a car with the money she had earned earlier. However, even with her own transport, daily trips over such long distances took too much of her time. Therefore, the girl began to look for a job closer to the university. This is how Christine first touched her dream Hollywood. She managed to get a part-time job with a film crew that was planning to shoot a movie. The experience of performing in a theater group helped the girl quickly adapt to the new working atmosphere. Eventually, she was hired as an assistant on the set of a thriller. Here, Christine met people who lived and breathed Hollywood. For a girl from the province, it was a real starry moment. She communicated with world-famous actors and directors and felt incredible happiness. Christine could not believe that she had the opportunity to interact with celebrities. The world of cinema completely captivated her. This work inspired young Christine so much that she wanted to be even closer to the film industry. The girl enrolled in professional makeup courses taught by Hollywood makeup artists. Having mastered these skills, she thought about becoming a makeup artist on a film set. For this, Christine was going to go to the city of her dreams, Los Angeles. Although it was quite a risky journey, curiosity overcame the fear of the unknown. The girl was irresistibly drawn to Hollywood. Eventually, Christine moved to Los Angeles, a city where several famous film studios are located at once. For a young and attractive girl, it was a real period of trials and temptations, but she demonstrated the best manners and decency that only a young lady is capable of. Despite the popular trends in the environment she found herself in, Christine did not lead a dissolute lifestyle. The girl avoided noisy parties and get-togethers, remaining a rather modest person. She had a relationship with a guy she had met a few years ago and continued to communicate with, overcoming the distance between them. Later, he moved to Christine, and starting from 2002, the young people decided to rent an apartment in Los Angeles together. Since they had not yet achieved financial stability, such a step was beneficial for both of them. It was a difficult adventure, but Christine did not lose heart and began to look for a new job on a permanent basis. However, difficulties arose with this. The girl managed to find only temporary part-time jobs, and there was no serious work. The lion's share of their joint budget was earned by her boyfriend. Meanwhile, relations between Christine and Todd became more and more tense. Later, the girl complained to her mother that verbal altercations with her beloved increasingly turned into physical violence on his part. She found herself trapped in a toxic relationship, complicated by financial hardship. Christine's mother began to look for new housing for her daughter so that she could move away from her problematic partner. Eventually, Christine broke up with her boyfriend and settled in a small apartment. She continued to get an education remotely. During this period, her father provided the girl with substantial financial support. He believed that his daughter would finally find her place in life and realize her calling, so he sought to help her in every possible way. By November 2002, Christine finally managed to get a job at a mobile communications company, but this position was far from her ideals. Neither the field of activity nor the level of income met the girl's expectations. In addition, Christine still could not find acceptable housing near her place of work. Instead, her mother found a cozy house in the town of Santa Monica, neighboring Los Angeles, which had to be shared with 2 more girls. The attractive thing was that it was located next to the beach in a lively residential area. It seemed like an ideal place to get on her feet, so Christine moved there. During this period, the girl transferred to the University of Santa Monica. Christine's dreams of Hollywood did not come true. She failed to start a career, her relationship with her beloved fell apart, and she was actually forced to start her life from scratch. However, the girl did not lose heart and continued to steadily go towards her dream. On February 15, 2003, Christine planned to attend a party. Before that, the young beauty visited a shopping center. She had a long, fun conversation with her mother, during which they discussed the girl's plans for the future. This call was Christine's last contact with her loved ones. The next day, on Sunday, February 16, 2003, the mother was eagerly waiting for a call from her daughter, hoping to hear about how the previous day had gone. However, the girl never got in touch. The worried woman tried to call Christine herself, but her phone was unavailable. At first, this did not cause serious concern, because the daughter could be resting or at work and not hear the call. However, the next day there was still no news from Christine. Around 9 in the morning, the alarmed mother called her daughter's work. Christine was always in touch and answered calls, but this time an answering machine worked instead of her. Then the woman contacted the girl's manager, who informed her that she had not shown up for work. He emphasized that Christine was a very responsible employee, and during the last 3 months she had no delays or absenteeism. The girl's absence surprised all her colleagues, but they also could not reach her. As the manager said, Christine was last seen at work on February 14th. One of her co-workers recalled that the girl was going to some party. The mother of the missing girl visited her daughter's page on social networks, hoping to find useful information about this event. But in vain, Christine had not published a single photo. Although previously she actively maintained her profile, actually documenting every step of her life. The woman also checked her daughter's bank accounts, but no transactions had been made since her disappearance. In search of her daughter, the mother called all the hospitals, but Christine was not registered anywhere. So on February 17th, she decided to contact the Santa Monica Police Department with a statement about the disappearance of her 21-year-old daughter. The investigators checked whether a girl matching the description had been involved in traffic accidents during these days, but found nothing. The missing beauty's neighbors also heard nothing about her since her disappearance. The police turned to Christine's ex-boyfriend, Todd, with whom she had a rather stormy and sometimes violent relationship. The version was considered that he could have found his beloved who had run away from him and done something to her, but the young man denied seeing the girl. Christine's neighbors were only able to provide superficial information about the last day they saw the girl. According to them, on Saturday, February 15th, the missing girl was going to some party, but with whom and where exactly they did not know. The same information came from the girl's colleagues when they communicated with her mother. This clue became the first in the investigation, so the detectives began to carefully check it. Later, another detective joined the case. While reviewing the collected materials, he was struck by the photo of the missing girl. The crime victim bore a striking resemblance to another girl who had disappeared earlier and was found dead in 1995. That girl, starting her modeling career, agreed to a photo shoot for the glossy magazine Photographer, but these plans were not destined to come true. It was about Linda Sobek, killed by photographer Charles Redburn. He lured the beautiful blonde out of town by deception, where he dishonored and took her life. The policeman knew that at the time of Christine's disappearance, Linda's killer was already serving a sentence in prison, so physically he could not be involved in the new crime. However, it could be a follower of Charles who was inspired by his scheme of action. Detectives needed at least some clue related to the missing girl, so they put out an alert for her car, a white Mazda Miata. At the same time, while communicating with Christine's mother, investigators found out more details about the girl's ex-boyfriend Todd, and also learned the name of her new chosen one, Lucas. However, the woman knew very little about the latter. She could not even name his last name, which greatly complicated the search. More than 48 hours had passed since Christine's disappearance, a critical period in such cases. The police seriously considered the possibility that the girl might already be dead. They began to analyze the billing data of her mobile phone. It turned out that the last outgoing call was made on February 15th at 17:34. Christine called the directory service at 411, which could indicate that she was in trouble and was trying to clarify an address or someone's phone number. The conversation lasted about 3 minutes, so this communication could be of great importance for the investigation. Unfortunately, it was not possible to find out the exact content of the dialogue, since such calls were not recorded. After that conversation, the girl's mobile phone was discharged. The last location of the gadget, recorded by the system, indicated the area of Ventura Boulevard. The police decided to involve the media in the investigation. The headlines immediately featured messages about Christine's disappearance with hints of the similarity of this case to Linda's murder. In search of clues, investigators carefully searched the apartment where Christine lived. Among the finds was a receipt from a lingerie store, dated the day the girl disappeared, February 15th. The police managed to find out that, despite the aggressive behavior of her ex-boyfriend, Christine continued to maintain contact with him. Sometimes she visited him, the last time on February 7th, but the detectives managed to find the most serious clue while studying the missing girl's email. On February 13th, Christine sent a message to the party coordinator, in which she expressed a passionate anticipation of the holiday and her intention to buy a ticket. In response, she was informed about the complete sale of tickets, but assured that she would be included in a separate waiting list. This is a fairly common practice among organizers of events. With the participation of celebrities in this way, they encourage visitors to buy VIP tickets at greatly inflated prices. Finally, the police managed to find Christine's new boyfriend, Lucas, and talk to him. According to the young man, he last saw the girl on February 14th, the day before her disappearance. They watched a movie together, after which they parted. Lucas successfully passed a polygraph test, had a reliable alibi, and did not arouse any suspicion among the investigators. Later, the detectives interrogated Christine's ex-boyfriend Todd, but he also had an alibi, confirmed by several witnesses. It turned out that at the time of the girl's disappearance, Todd was out of town. Among all the versions, the police were most interested in the one that was associated with the party where Christine was heading and from where she never returned. Investigators were convinced that the key to unraveling the girl's disappearance lies here. They contacted the organizers of the event and were shocked by what they heard. It turns out that Christine never bought a ticket and did not show up at the party. But where did the girl go then? To restore the chronology of events on the fateful evening, the police tracked transactions from the missing girl's bank card. This helped to establish all the stores that Christine visited that day. Law enforcement officers carefully reviewed the recordings from video surveillance cameras in these establishments, hoping to identify something extraordinary or stumble upon clues. But this painstaking work took a lot of time. In parallel with the analysis of these data, the police received an alarming call. A woman named Susan Murphy reported a suspicious guy she met at a store. He introduced himself as Victor Thomas, an employee of a film company that conducts casting for a new James Bond movie. The man began to put psychological pressure on Susan, inviting her to the role of Bond's girl and admiring her beauty. He persistently inclined the woman to participate in the casting, but this seemed extremely suspicious to her. Susan barely managed to refuse at the last moment. Fortunately, she went to meet with the stranger accompanied by her husband, a former police officer. Susan's husband personally spoke with Victor, trying to inquire about his true intentions, but the suspect suddenly fled without providing any useful information. Later, Susan decided to check all the data she knew about Victor and found out that he was lying. Victor Thomas had nothing to do with the film industry. Moreover, a person with that name did not exist at all. It seems that the man invented a legend, similar to Linda Sabic's killer, in order to meet a beautiful woman. But for what purpose remained a mystery. Although Susan's story ended well, Victor was still at large and could continue his shenanigans. Therefore, the police urgently began to check the received information and search for the suspicious guy. It was quite possible that he had evil intentions. Investigators studied the recordings from surveillance cameras of all the stores where Christine made purchases on the eve of her disappearance, but found nothing worthy of attention. Then they decided to go around the shops and interview the staff. The salespeople were shown a sketch of Victor, who allegedly harassed beautiful girls. In one of the stores, the cashier recalled seeing a similar man, but could not provide any more details. Eventually, an artist arrived on the scene to compile a sketch of the suspect. The search for Christine was gaining momentum. Dog handlers with dogs and volunteers were sent to the area from where the girl last got in touch and called the directory service. Patrols and volunteers continued to look for the missing girl's car and Christine herself. There were many messages from citizens that a similar car was seen in different places, but all these clues turned out to be false. Finally, on February 24th, an important signal was received by the police. In the parking lot of the shopping center that Christine visited on the day of her disappearance, her car was found a white Mazda Miata. The forensic expert who arrived at the scene conducted a thorough inspection of the interior, seized fingerprints and all potential evidence. A bottle of water was found on the back seat, and the missing girl's mobile phone was on the front seat. But the investigators were most surprised by the story of the parking lot guide. The man recalled a strange incident related to this car. The car drove into the spot at 17:45, although it was reserved for another client. Some man got out of the car who, upon hearing the guard's remark, behaved extremely aggressively. The stranger threw the car keys at the guard and left without any explanation. There was no one in the cabin at that time. Unfortunately, there were no surveillance cameras in the parking lot, so it was not possible to see the driver. Having no clues, the detectives decided to return to the analysis of Christine's purchases on the day of her disappearance. What they found shocked the investigators. On the eve of her disappearance, the girl bought clothes that exactly matched the description provided by Susan. When inviting the woman to the casting, Victor asked her to wear an extremely short black mini-skirt, a white blouse, stockings, and shoes. It was these very items that were paid for with Christine's credit card. The police ruled out the possibility of a simple coincidence. It seemed that the girl had fallen for the bait of a fraudster whose true motives remained a mystery. Christine repeated Susan's fate. Only the latter was lucky to have an escort in the form of her husband. Unfortunately, no information about the mysterious Victor could be found, and law enforcement officers were at an impasse. They turned to Christine's roommates again. The girls recalled that the missing woman was indeed going to some kind of casting, but they could not provide any details. During the conversation, they managed to remember that the audition was definitely related to a James Bond movie. According to them, Christine was extremely excited on the eve of the event. The description of her outfit, a blouse and a mini-skirt in which she left the house, completely coincided with the officers' fears. Christine was very afraid of being late for the casting scheduled for 17:30. She was wearing the exact revealing clothes that the villain had asked Susan to wear, and possibly Christine herself. Detectives continued to review the surveillance camera footage over and over again, hoping to find Victor. Eventually, they managed to spot the right man in the store where the employees mentioned him. However, the video quality was so low that it was impossible to make out facial features. Still, it was at least some kind of lead. Using eyewitness testimony, investigators were able to compile an approximate portrait of the suspect. By February 26th, a sketch of the main suspect in the disappearance of the young beauty was created. One of the experienced detectives, having familiarized himself with the case materials, recognized Victor Paleologus in it, who had been released on parole very recently, on January 20th, 23. In the past, the man had already been convicted of a sexual crime. Among the episodes of his rich criminal past, there was a case when he lured a woman named Christine Kludgian to his apartment in a similar manner. After inviting her to a supposedly noisy party with celebrities, Victor met the victim in an empty, quiet house. There he began to harass the guest, and when she resisted, he attacked her. The attacker used a rope, strangled Christine with it, and then tried to tie the woman up for violence. But the victim had enough strength to break free, run out of the apartment, and call the neighbors for help. Victor Paleologus used the same scheme, luring victims with promises of casting or invitations to parties. This technique worked flawlessly, especially near the Walk of Fame. Many girls came to Los Angeles in search of fulfilling their Hollywood dream, and villains like Victor took advantage of this. For the first attack on a girl, Paleologus got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, there was an attempt to dishonor Katie DeBiono in 1998. Then he called himself Brian, a movie producer. For this crime, he was punished with a minimum term. There was reason to believe that Victor was also involved in embezzlement of funds in the company where he previously worked. In addition, the police identified many other victims, women whom Paleologus tried to use. However, all the statements of the victims were ignored by law enforcement officers due to lack of evidence. Once Victor broke into the house of his ex-girlfriend. Although he did not manage to bring his criminal intent to the end, the man still stole money and jewelry from the home. And even for this act, he got off with only a suspended sentence. Later, an even more serious case occurred. Victor lured a girl named Heather into a trap. As always, he incited her to dress in a seductive manner. It seems that this particular appearance of the victim excited him the most. Then Paleologus tried to tie the girl up in order to get intimate, but Heather miraculously managed to break free. Somehow she managed to push the attacker away with the sharp heel of her shoe. These precious seconds allowed her to run out of the trap and hide in her own car. The girl filed a statement against the offender. For this crime, Victor received 2 years in prison, but was released on parole on January 20th, 2003. This happened just 3 weeks before Christine's disappearance. It seems that once at liberty, the repeat offender took up the old. By the time the police got on the trail of Paleologus, he had already been arrested. This time he stole a BMW X5 in Beverly Hills and tried to sell the car with forged documents. The detainee was found to have a wallet with a whole bunch of stolen IDs, credit cards, and other documents. Victor perfectly matched the type of criminal involved in Christine's disappearance. His handwriting completely coincided with what was known to the investigation. All the facts pointed to Paleologus, so the detectives decided to show his photo to Susan, who avoided the attack thanks to the intervention of her husband. At the police station, Susan unhesitatingly pointed to Victor's photograph among other pictures. Later, during the identification procedure, she again unmistakably identified him, noting that she immediately recognized the man, despite obvious attempts to change his appearance. Paleologus slouched a little, extended one arm, making it longer than the other, and combed his hair in a new way. But all these tricks did not help him avoid exposure. During a separate check, Susan's husband, who once tried to detain the criminal, also recognized him. Unfortunately, the parking lot guard where the missing girl's car was found could not identify the suspect. He only managed to see Victor for a moment from afar and in the dark, without seeing his face. At the time the photo was presented, Paleologus was already behind bars, although on the day of Christine's disappearance he was still at large. During the interrogation, the suspect denied any involvement in the girl's disappearance and flatly refused to admit the fact of communicating with Susan, despite the presence of irrefutable evidence to the contrary. Victor refused to testify without a lawyer, explaining this by his recent parole and fears that he was being framed. So the detectives continued to collect evidence against him. Soon a new witness came forward, a realtor who had been working with Victor for the last few weeks and noticed some oddities in his behavior. Paleologus was looking through a real estate agent for a house worth up to $700,000. They inspected several properties every day when suddenly a message came about the disappearance of documents and keys from one of the houses. Then the realtor did not even suspect that his client could be involved in this. But as soon as he saw Victor's photo in the news summary, everything fell into place. The witness also identified the suspect. According to him, their last meeting took place just a day before Christine's disappearance. Then Victor behaved strangely. He was somewhat nervous. In one of the inspected houses, he went to the toilet and began to shout loudly from there, allegedly checking the quality of sound insulation. The police suggested that this way the man could look for a place for his criminal actions, where the screams of the victims would remain unheard. Detectives examined all the houses that Paleologus visited. They paid special attention to the object that so intrigued the suspect. Interestingly, this dwelling was located in the same area where Christine's mobile phone signal was last recorded. Investigators literally turned the house upside down, looking for at least some evidence of Victor's involvement in the girl's disappearance or her possible body, but found nothing.
Meanwhile, searches continued in Paleologus' apartment. Photos of women in clothes that the suspect seemed to especially like were found on his computer. A short skirt, a white blouse, stockings, and high-heeled shoes. It had been 12 days since the start of the investigation, but the missing girl's family still cherished the hope of Christine returning home alive.
Victor continued to deny everything and was in no hurry to share any information with the police. He only confirmed the fact of meeting the girl, after which, according to him, they went their separate ways and he did not see her again. Victor Paleologus was born in 1962 in Pennsylvania into an ordinary family. He was the youngest of 5 brothers. The man graduated from college with a bachelor's degree, after which he entered graduate school in Los Angeles. From 1990 to 1993, he was married. Interestingly, some facts indicated that in 1991 Victor could have tried to poison his wife when she filed a statement against him. All of Paleologus' attempts to organize his own restaurant business failed. It seemed that this was a world-weary loser who had slipped into a life of crime.
It seems that Victor's fetish for beautiful women forced him to cross a dangerous line, and he began to attack them for the purpose of intimacy and sexual gratification. Regarding the evening of Christine's disappearance, Paleologus, together with his lawyer, provided an alibi. Allegedly, Victor had dinner with an acquaintance in a restaurant. This information was indeed confirmed, but law enforcement officers understood that despite this, the man still had enough time to play out another criminal drama and kidnap a new victim. On March 1st, another witness called the police. According to his statement, on February 15th, he saw the missing girl. She stopped near his house in search of some mansion that resembled a castle. The man could not help her because he himself did not know where this building was located. Instead, his wife, hearing their conversation, told Christine the direction.
The incident occurred around 1730. Now it became clear for what purpose the girl dialed the number of the directory service 411. She needed navigation to a building that looked like a castle. Investigators had a new lead. Moreover, it was in such a house that Victor checked the quality of sound insulation. Everything pointed to him. While the detectives were working with this data, a new event occurred. On March 3, 2003, 4 teenage friends were walking through the Hollywood Hills, admiring the picturesque panorama of Los Angeles. Suddenly, one of the guys, approaching the edge of a cliff, noticed some strange object below, 100 meters from him. At first, the young men thought it was a mannequin. They tried to go down to take a closer look at the find, but could not overcome the entire distance. However, this was enough to understand that it was a human body. The frightened guys for a long time could not decide what to do next, because none of them took a mobile phone with them. Eventually, they went to the police station. On the way, the teenagers met a woman who was walking dogs and told her about the horrendous find. She approached the body to make sure the guys were not mistaken. The victim was wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt. Her legs were tied and wrapped in blue fabric. The hands of the deceased were behind her back, and a hairband was on her right wrist. Below the waist, tattered stockings were visible. Frightened by what she saw, the woman called the police. Soon, law enforcement officers and rescuers arrived at the scene. They had to sweat a lot to get the mutilated body from the hard-to-reach area. Obviously, the criminal hoped that his victim would never be found here. Perhaps this would have happened if it were not for the quick-witted teenagers who accidentally wandered into this deserted area. The forensic expert identified the deceased as the missing Christine Johnson. Her body was found not far from the house that Victor liked so much during the real estate viewing with the realtor. The girl's parents were immediately informed about the tragic news, who could not believe the reality of what had happened and did not hold back their despair over the loss of their daughter. Christine's entire body was covered with bruises and scratches, indicating desperate attempts to resist. The corpse was in a terrible condition and had time to undergo significant putrefactive changes, lying under the scorching sun for more than 1 day. In addition, it rained 1 day. The face was especially disfigured, which was facilitated by both numerous injuries and the unnatural position of the deceased's body with her head lowered. Someone tore off the girl's ear. The expert also noted large bruises on Christine's head and neck, which indicated a traumatic brain injury and strangulation. Initially, this was recognized as the cause of death, but soon even more horrific details were clarified. Investigators had no doubt that it was Victor Paleologus who was involved in the murder of Christine Johnson. However, it was necessary to prove that at the time of the girl's death, the suspect did not have an alibi. For this purpose, the detectives went to Joey, an acquaintance with whom Victor allegedly had dinner that fatal evening. But it turned out that in fact it was not a friend, but a casual acquaintance. During a thorough interrogation, the man admitted that he and Victor had agreed to meet much later than the incident with Christine occurred. According to Joey, they met Paleologus only the day before. On February 15th, Victor was late for the meeting, arriving around midnight, although they initially planned to meet much earlier. The suspect's face had fresh scratches, which he explained as an accidental injury during the move. The police step-by-step recreated the probable sequence of events that preceded the disappearance of Christine Johnson. According to the investigation, the criminal noticed a beautiful young girl in a shopping center where he often hunted for victims and decided to act according to the usual scenario. He introduced himself as a film industry worker and offered Christine to audition for the role of James Bond's girl. Victor was remarkably convincing. Acting according to a well-established scheme, he showered the girl with compliments, assuring that she was perfect for this role. Given Christine's youth and ambitions, she believed the villain and could not refuse the tempting offer. Paleologus scheduled a meeting in one of the houses that he recently inspected with a realtor, explaining that this was where the audition would take place. Christine, somewhere deep down suspecting a trap, still prepared for the casting and dressed the way Victor asked. She arrived at the place with a slight delay, as she got lost on the way and contacted the directory service. This is how the girl found herself in the clutches of a deadly trap from which she never got out. During the meeting, Christine became a victim of Victor's harassment, but desperately resisted and even managed to scratch his face. But she had nowhere to run, and the physically stronger man quickly overcame the resistance. Paleologus dishonored the helpless girl and then killed her to get rid of an unwanted witness. First, he hit her on the head and strangled her, and only then threw the mutilated body into the Hollywood Hills. But the most terrible thing was that the traumatic brain injury and strangulation did not lead to Christine's instant death. The girl only lost consciousness, and the inhuman victim mistook it for death. By throwing the body off a cliff, he doomed the victim to a slow and painful death. Christine, having fallen from a considerable height, received numerous fractures and internal injuries. She regained consciousness for some time, but never waited for rescue, bleeding to death alone. Only a few hours later, the girl finally died from her injuries. On May 12, 2003, the district attorney officially charged Victor Paleologus with kidnapping, violence, and first-degree murder. However, the defense was fully prepared to defend the client's innocence because there was a lack of direct evidence of his guilt. The prosecution faced a difficult battle, so forensic experts used all the available weighty arguments. Victor's lawyers questioned the time of the victim's death, referring to the insects found on the body. Instead, prosecutors emphasized the striking similarity of the killer's handwriting with previous attacks on women. The cases were so identical that it was impossible not to mention them in court. Preparation for the trial was delayed, so Victor Paleologus appeared before the jury only in July 2006. The defense emphasized that the prosecution actually had no material evidence against the defendant, no DNA analysis, no fingerprints, no video surveillance recordings that would link him to the murder. This was explained by the fact that Christine's mutilated body was found only 2 weeks after her disappearance, and during this time most of the traces had time to deteriorate. However, the testimony of women accusing Victor of harassment and attacks was more than enough. After their statements, the sympathies were on the side of the prosecution. Without exception, all the victims talked about Victor's remarkable talent for manipulation. The man was so careful and convincing that even the most cautious victims like Susan Murphy initially believed his sweet promises and agreed to take part in the alleged casting, not even suspecting what was really waiting for them. It seemed that after hearing this, no one had any doubts that it was Victor Paleologus who killed the unfortunate Christine. But the defendant had a last ace up his sleeve. To avoid the death penalty, Victor proposed to make a deal with the investigation and plead guilty to a less serious crime. Now the fate of Paleologus was in the hands of the relatives of the deceased girl. At that time, the exhausting trial had been going on for 3 weeks and threatened to drag on for a long time. Given the uncertainty of the verdict and the burden of the grief experienced, Christine's family agreed to make concessions in exchange for a confession. However, Victor unexpectedly changed his mind and on the day of sentencing sent the judge an 11-page petition asking to cancel his confession. Fortunately, the law was on the side of justice, and it was no longer possible to cancel the previous statement. The court found Victor Paleologus guilty on all counts and sentenced him to life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 25 years. Friendship plays a crucial role in a person's life during their teenage years. However, finding a true friend with whom you can genuinely connect throughout the years is not an easy task. Sometimes those we consider close to us have selfish or even sinister intentions, and recognizing this in time is not always possible. Brittany Waki, the main character of our story, lived in the small town of Elko, Nevada. Her family moved here from Colorado Springs in 2010 when her father, Jim Waki, decided to take a job at the local mining company. The town seemed cozy and safe, perfect for living. The Wakis were happy to start fresh, but they didn't know that soon their lives would be shattered by a terrible tragedy. The tragedy that happened to Brittany is not an isolated case. Every year, more and more teenagers become victims of violent crimes. Statistics show that the number of homicides among young people is steadily increasing. This case is not just a story about a horrible crime. It's a warning that even the closest people may turn out to be completely different from what they seem, and that our vigilance and attention to detail can save someone's life. So today I'll tell you about Brittany Waki, an ordinary girl whose life was cut short by an insidious crime. Brittany adored horseback riding, and there were plenty of opportunities for that here. Cattle ranching and rodeo were traditional activities and hobbies of the locals, starting from a young age. This atmosphere immediately appealed to Brittany. There was picturesque wild nature, horseback riding, and ATV riding, which the main character of the story enjoyed. Of course, all this may seem like boyish hobbies, but in these parts, they were enjoyed by both boys and girls. Such hobbies only added to the charm of the beautiful Brittany. She was very close to her brother James, as the age difference between them was just over a year. The children, close in age, got along great, constantly spending time playing together and sharing each other's interests. However, such a mood prevailed throughout the Waki family. They were close-knit and loving people who did not leave each other in difficult times. Even when the parents decided to divorce, the mother and father calmly settled all issues so as not to traumatize the growing generation. After that, they maintained a friendly relationship. They didn't even have problems with the division of property and custody rights. The former husband and wife reached an agreement without arguments. After the separation, Alicia moved out of her ex-husband's house but settled nearby so that they could continue to raise their children together and not force them to make unnecessary moves. The mother and father took turns picking up their son and daughter and constantly communicated with each other. Such behavior helped to smooth out the traumatic nature of the divorce process, which inevitably affects every child. In particular, thanks to this approach, Brittany grew up to be an intelligent girl with strong moral principles and beliefs. She was very independent and not afraid of difficulties. Brittany began helping her father and mother with household chores from an early age and was entrusted with quite responsible tasks. Nevertheless, Brittany always coped excellently. By the age of 16, she had already matured enough and behaved like an adult. Brittany was great in the saddle and could herd cattle. Helping out on the ranch tempered Brittany's character and taught her a lot. She was admired by her loved ones and even neighbors who saw diligence and professionalism in her actions. At the same time, at the age of 16, Brittany remained a typical teenage girl with appropriate interests, such as experimenting with makeup and clothes. Brittany was an incredibly cheerful and friendly girl. After graduating from school, she dreamed of dedicating herself to studying psychiatry at university in order to be able to support people with mental disorders. The suffering of others always touched Brittany deeply, so it's not surprising that this activity was among her top priorities. She aspired to fulfill herself in this direction. But despite all her wonderful qualities, in 2020, Brittany faced bullying at school. Her best friend said that many people suddenly turned against the girl for no apparent reason. In her friend's opinion, the main motive for the bullying was jealousy and envy, as many girls envied Brittany's beauty and intelligence. As a result, Brittany had to switch to homeschooling. But she did not despair. Thanks to social networks, Brittany found a small circle of close people who sincerely loved and supported her. Brittany devoted even more time to her passion, horse racing, where she met like-minded people. It was there that she met Bryce, who was a few years older than her. They quickly got along and became friends. Brittany always spoke of him as an older brother, although it seems the guy wanted more. He constantly spent time with his friend, and Brittany herself got along well with his family. But despite this, their relationship remained purely friendly. Bryce was described as a polite and pleasant young man who, just like Brittany, was always ready to help those in need. The similarity of characters brought these two together. On March 8, 2020, the friends agreed to meet to spend time together as they often did. On the same day, Brittany's father, who played in a rock band, had a rehearsal. Brittany gladly joined him before meeting Bryce. She was in a great mood, cheerfully chatting with all the musicians. Brittany even invited Bryce to watch their performance, but the guy was late and missed the rehearsal. Bryce planned to pick up his friend in his car so they could watch a movie at his place, and then promised to take her back. It was assumed that Brittany's father would return around 7:30, and by that time, Brittany should have been waiting for him at home. When her father returned at the appointed time, it turned out that his daughter was not home yet. The man walked through the whole house calling Brittany by name, but there was no answer. He began to worry and tried to call her, but her number was turned off. This seemed extremely strange, because usually responsible Brittany always warned if her phone was about to die. She was never late, and even if she wasn't going to make it, she would definitely inform her family. The assumption that Brittany could have simply forgotten about the arrangement or lost track of time and not noticed that the evening had come sounded absolutely implausible. The worried father turned to his son, but he also had no idea where his sister might be. Then the man contacted the last person with whom Brittany was supposed to spend time that day, Bryce. The guy said that after a few hours spent in the city, he dropped his friend off at the school, where she met some young man unknown to him. After that, Bryce left so as not to interfere with their conversation. Brittany's father was surprised why they didn't watch the movie as they had originally planned. Bryce claimed that he and Brittany had simply changed their plans and decided to take a ride out of town. The father of the missing girl, of course, was interested in who she met, but Bryce did not know him personally. According to his description, it was a tall, light-skinned young man who looked like a cowboy. This information surprised the girl's father. It was unclear who the stranger was and why Bryce left his friend with him instead of giving her a ride home, as they had previously agreed. This was not at all like Bryce, who always cared about Brittany, and here he just left her with some guy and drove away. A strange situation. Immediately after talking with Brittany's father, Bryce wrote to her brother. He seemed to be very worried about what had happened and felt guilty for not taking his friend home. He said she herself asked to be left. But now Bryce realized the seriousness of the situation and feared that something might have happened to her. The only thing the guy remembered was the stranger's old Ford F-150 pickup truck, which he described as an unpleasant color. This detail only heightened the anxiety of the relatives because none of their acquaintances drove such a vehicle. Brittany's entire family did not sleep that night, dialing her number hundreds of times, but the calls were constantly redirected to voicemail. In addition, the father and brother patrolled the streets in a car, driving around the school and the entire city, hoping to find the missing girl. They called her friends and acquaintances. Finally, one of the friends recalled that shortly before the disappearance, Brittany had mentioned some guy named JT. She did not describe any details of their communication, but it seemed that Brittany was going to meet with him. This lead seemed very important for the investigation. The worried parents then turned to the police, but they initially assumed that the teenager might have simply run away from home or was hanging out with friends and would return soon. But the family knew it wasn't like Brittany. She had few friends and none of them knew where she was. The girl had never had problems with behavior or family, no addictions, mental disorders, or conflicts. No reason to run away. Her loved ones understood that such a disappearance concealed something bad. Eventually, the sheriff was convinced to take the case seriously. He was given all the information that could be gathered from Brittany's friends and acquaintances. Then the police decided to question Bryce and arranged a meeting near the school so that he could describe in detail what happened when he dropped the girl off. Bryce said that they were driving around the Spring Creek area as usual. Suddenly, his father called and asked him to come home urgently to help with some errands. Brittany agreed to postpone the ride, only asking to be dropped off at the school. She admitted that she wanted to meet her new acquaintance, JT. Bryce saw her heading towards a green pickup truck where a white guy in a cowboy hat was sitting, but he just drove away without even making sure if she got into the car. Bryce poorly remembered the details and didn't even pay attention to the pickup truck's license plate. The detectives did not suspect him of lying and decided to let him go, focusing on other areas of the search. The investigation decided to draw public attention through the media, hoping that someone might have noticed the guy in the cowboy hat and his green pickup truck. The police especially hoped to find out the vehicle's number, but the locals were in no hurry to share information. The sheriff turned to the telephone company to determine the last location of Brittany's cell phone. It turned out that her phone had last registered activity 7 kilometers from the school where Bryce had dropped her off. Law enforcement immediately went to this address, hoping to find new leads. However, a thorough inspection of the area yielded no results. Brittany's family and friends tirelessly patrolled the streets, posting flyers with her photo. More than 500 announcements were distributed throughout the city and its surroundings, but the locals stubbornly remained silent. No one was in a hurry to assist the investigation. It seemed that Brittany had vanished into thin air. The mother of the missing girl even created a group on social networks where she constantly posted up-to-date information about the search progress. But even this did not yield results. Suddenly, she received a message from an unknown number. The anonymous person claimed to have kidnapped Brittany and demanded a ransom of $25,000. Threatening to feed her to the dogs if the demands were not met. Later, he wrote again, informing them that Brittany was sick and could die without medicine. The criminal insisted that the captive would receive medications only if he was paid the specified amount. At first, the parents were ready to agree to this, but they decided to turn to the police first. Brittany's mother called the police station and told them about the situation. She was immediately invited to come so they could try to track the extortionist's number. It seemed that the investigation had a valuable lead. While the officers were trying to establish the owner of the number, the head of one of the search teams contacted the police station. He reported that volunteers were combing the area 20 kilometers from the city and suddenly noticed a puddle on the side of the road that looked like dried blood. The team got out of their vehicles and began to examine the territory. 100 meters from the road, in the bushes, they found a blue tarp under which lay the body of a girl. She was face down, partially undressed. The description of the clothes matched what Brittany was wearing on the day of her disappearance, but it was necessary to officially identify the deceased before informing the family. Right during the conversation with the missing girl's mother, a detective entered the office and said that the conversation would have to be postponed due to the urgent need to go to the place where the body was found. The woman burst into tears, feeling in her heart that it was her little girl who had been found. Unfortunately, the mother's intuition did not fail her. She recognized Brittany. A few meters from the body, forensic experts found a keychain with her name, which was later identified as the victim's property. The girl had clearly been coerced into intimacy. Her pants and underwear were pulled down to her ankles. She had been strangled and her throat was slashed. This was the cause of death. On the nearest bushes, officers noticed the victim's headphones, which were hanging from the wires caught on the branches. A used condom was also found here, and its packaging was lying next to the body. Now there was more than enough material to search for the criminal. The investigators were most interested in the new acquaintance, JT, about whom most people from the victim's circle had heard, but no one could say anything specific about him. Investigators were looking for this guy. The news of the murder shook the entire town. Almost all of its inhabitants knew each other by sight, so such a terrible crime could not but resonate in people's hearts. Particularly strong support for the Waki family came through social networks. Bryce stood out the most as he had been in close communication with the victim's mother, father, and brother the whole time. He helped the family, cried, and said that he would never forget this bright person who had become a close friend to him. The detective's work was just beginning. It was necessary to obtain warrants to examine the girl's computer and cell phone. In addition, it was necessary to analyze the discovered evidence, including the DNA from the condom, the main key to the puzzle. It was assumed that Brittany could have been the victim of an internet predator with a propensity for sexual violence. Just in case, a list of registered sex offenders in the area who could be involved in the tragedy was quickly compiled and checked. All this needed to be compared in order to track down the criminal, but these processes take a lot of time, so the investigation dragged on. In parallel, the information from the kidnapper was being checked. The police quickly managed to establish the phone number from which the victim's mother had been called with ransom demands. Unfortunately, it was not registered in Nevada. It turned out to be a hidden number purchased on the internet, so it was not possible to track the data. However, the very fact of such messages spoke volumes. In the life of the Waki family, there was clearly a person who took pleasure in such bullying and wanted to profit from this tragic case. According to the detectives, the one who used it was most likely connected with Brittany's death. Of course, first of all, the investigators wanted to understand who JT was. It was believed that this young man was the most likely criminal. Having obtained data from the murdered girl's phone, law enforcement quickly tracked down the mysterious man. However, the detectives' disappointment knew no bounds. It turned out that at the time of Brittany's death, JT was in Alaska. They had met shortly before the events described. Indeed, Brittany and JT were going to meet, but he clearly could not be the one who used and killed her by slashing her throat. The guy had not left Alaska during that period, so it was a false lead. Investigators decided to check other guys and men with the same initials driving similar vehicles who lived in the city, its surroundings, and near the place where the body was found. The detectives managed to find only two. Both were young ranch workers driving green pickup trucks, but at the time of the murder they were too far away and had reliable alibis. The investigation had reached a dead end, so they decided to contact the family of the deceased again, hoping that some information might have been missed. Brittany's mother said that a few weeks before her daughter's death, she had been dating a guy close to the cowboy lifestyle. He lived on a ranch and was engaged in rodeo, but they quickly broke up due to the girl's refusal of intimacy. Despite maintaining a friendly relationship, the breakup was caused by several unpleasant quarrels during which he wished Brittany dead. However, after checking, this man also had a confirmed alibi. It seemed that the investigation was reaching another dead end. The last way to calculate the probable rapist and murderer remained: to review all the recordings from surveillance cameras in the city that could have captured a green pickup truck with a cowboy at the wheel. Fortunately, in the direction Brittany was moving before her death, calmly sitting in her killer's car, there were several high-quality cameras. They provided a clear picture, but ahead lay dozens of hours of video footage. No matter how much time the investigators spent viewing it, they could not detect the vehicle Bryce had described. There was no green pickup truck. The strangest thing was that it did not appear on the surveillance cameras near the school where her friend had supposedly dropped the girl off. However, the police managed to notice something else, no less attractive to attention. The blue Chevy pickup truck that Bryce himself drove did indeed end up on the recording, but the guy did not stop or drop anyone off. He simply drove past the school without stopping. So, he had lied about the green pickup truck. The detectives then decided to trace the direction of his vehicle's movement. The young man had previously admitted that he had been driving around the area with his friend for several hours, but this also turned out to be untrue, given the results of watching the video cameras. They decided to request Bryce's cell phone data to compare his geolocation with the location of the attack victim. The detectives managed to quickly obtain a warrant to access this information, given the reasonableness of the suspicions. The young man was not informed about anything, fearing that they would spook the new suspect. It was obvious that he had been next to Brittany the entire day. Their movement trajectories completely coincided, right up to the moment her mobile phone was turned off. Moreover, he had clearly been at the place where the deceased's body was found, and then went home. It became clear that the friend had been at the crime scene and had either killed the girl himself or witnessed the massacre. To confirm the assumption, it was necessary to conduct an examination. The guy was immediately asked to take tests and provide DNA samples. He agreed and submitted the materials, but for the time being they were forced to let him go. The investigators did not tell him about their suspicions. On the contrary, they pretended that everything was fine. They said they were taking samples from everyone in the missing girl's circle to exclude them from the list of suspects. Skin particles were also found under the victim's nails. All these materials eventually matched Bryce's DNA samples. There was no doubt that he had engaged in sexual intercourse with Brittany, but everything had happened involuntarily. Brittany had been forced into this. Finally, Bryce was invited for questioning once again, without revealing their true intentions and the information that was already known to the investigation at that time. The young man agreed without resistance. As before, he behaved calmly and confidently. The detectives tried to find out if he had ever had a relationship with Brittany, particularly a sexual one, but he denied any such arguments. According to him, the guy considered the girl more of a sister than a possible partner. After that, the investigators gradually began to lead the main suspect to the exposure of the lie. Obviously, if Bryce was telling the truth, no traces of his DNA would have been found. But the investigator reported that a condom with his seminal fluid was found at the murder scene. Perhaps realizing what the detective was hinting at, the young man changed his testimony. He began to claim that Brittany had indeed flirted with him that day, which she had never done before. The story continued to transform. The guy said that they started kissing, then, by mutual agreement, engaged in oral sex with a condom. According to the suspect's story, this happened on the side of the road,
where the body was later found. According to the young man, after intimacy, he still took her to meet another guy, but changed the address, informing them that they did not get out in the school area. Bryce continued to stick to the version with the guy in the green pickup truck, insisting that he did not see the cowboy properly, so he could not describe him in detail or name the car's number. The investigators summed it up. From Bryce's words, it followed that after the other guy picked up Brittany, they, for some reason, went to the same place where the used condom was thrown away, and the body was later found. There, the stranger killed the girl. Of course, it all sounded absurd, especially given that no foreign DNA was found on the murdered girl's body. But there were plenty of Bryce's traces. They were found under the nails, in intimate places, and even on the neck in the area of the knife wound that doomed the girl to death. In addition, given Bryce's movement trajectory and surveillance camera footage, it was confirmed that the guy did not stop anywhere else, so this was another of his lies. The suspect was informed about all these discrepancies. Under the pressure of the investigators, the young man broke down and finally confessed that he had killed Brittany, but called what happened an accident. The suspect insisted that she wanted rough sex with a knife and, in a fit of passion, impaled herself on the blade. It sounded completely implausible, given his constant lying. Finally, 18-year-old Bryce was arrested. This happened on March 19, 2020, and then searches were conducted in his house and car. After obtaining a warrant, the detectives came to Bryce's home. In the guy's closet, they found a pair of bloody shoes with traces of the victim, as well as a knife that was the probable murder weapon. A bloody hoodie was found in the trunk of the car. All of this contained the victim's blood, as well as numerous fingerprints and DNA samples from Bryce. After the family of the deceased was told who the killer really was, they were in complete shock. Brittany's mother, father, and brother considered Bryce a decent young man, their daughter's best friend, and treated him like a son. The victim's relatives would never have believed that he had done it if there hadn't been such a large amount of incriminating evidence against the guy. The family trusted this person like a relative, and he simply took advantage of this with the most insidious purpose. The hearings began only 2 years later, in May 2022. On the prosecution side, there were many convincing witnesses, among whom was Bryce's ex-girlfriend. She told them who the ex-boyfriend really was, and this picture was strikingly different from most people's ideas about the defendant. The townspeople considered him a real cowboy and an exemplary guy, ready to help in a difficult moment. In reality, it was all just a mask. As you know, Brittany's family trusted the killer because he looked after the girl in a brotherly way. He controlled her so that she would come home on time, carefully gave her rides, which seemed very cute. In fact, this was not done with the best intentions. He simply wanted to know everything about his future victim, as manipulators do. According to the defendant's ex-girlfriend, Bryce could sometimes be very aggressive and cruel. He constantly provoked quarrels and strangled her at least 4 times during conflicts. The last time it was so serious that Brittany had already said goodbye to life. Fortunately, he did not cross the line. After she broke up with Bryce, the guy stalked and threatened her for a long time until the victim's parents began to threaten to contact law enforcement. The jury did not need to be convinced of the criminal's guilt for long, given the obvious evidence, but the lawyer fiercely defended his client, voicing the most absurd assumptions. After 9 days of hearings, it took the jurors about an hour to discuss the verdict. All the jurors agreed that Bryce was guilty of first-degree murder and coercion into intimate relations. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving a 20-year term. For the use of a deadly weapon, he received another 20 years. The same for abduction, and for coercion into intimacy by force, another 10 years were added to the sentence. Bryce went behind bars for life. He will be able to go free only after 70 years in prison. Most likely, Bryce will never be released. To the great regret of Brittany's family, Bryce never reported the motive for the crime. It remained a mystery what could have provoked his aggression. However, the veil of secrecy was lifted by the deceased's friend.
Brittany knew that a few days before the murder, Bryce had confessed his love to Brittany, but she did not reciprocate, suggesting that they remain friends. The detective suggested that the guy could not survive the rejection and harbored a grudge against her, and when he found out that she was communicating with a new guy named JT, he went off the rails, decided to teach his victim a lesson, and take revenge on her. The tragic story of Brittany Waki is not only a story about a brutal crime, but also a warning for each of us. This Brittany became a victim of a person she unreservedly trusted, her best friend, Bryce. It was blind trust and the inability to see a person's true face behind the mask of benevolence that led to this tragedy. Brittany, like her family, considered Bryce a wonderful guy, almost a family member. His care and willingness to help seemed like genuine manifestations of friendship, but in reality, manipulation and insidious intentions were hidden behind this. Bryce wanted to control the girl's every move, to know about all her actions and connections. And when Brittany refused him in response to a declaration of love and became interested in another, Bryce decided to take brutal revenge. This story teaches us to be more careful in relationships, not to trust people blindly even if they seem to be the best of friends. It is worth paying attention to alarming bells, to incomprehensible or suspicious actions, to manifestations of aggression and excessive control. One cannot underestimate the danger and risks even when they seem unlikely. At the same time, the tragedy could have been avoided, or the crime could have been solved faster if law enforcement had acted more promptly and attentively. Initially, the police did not take the girl's disappearance too seriously, assuming that she could have run away from home or hung out with friends. If the investigation had started immediately, perhaps Brittany could have been saved. In addition, the girl's family and friends believed Bryce's words for too long, although there were many inconsistencies and contradictions in his story. If they had suspected something wrong earlier and shared their doubts with the investigation, it could have expedited the disclosure of the crime and the arrest of the killer.
Taylor Bell, a high school graduate from the small town of Vienna in the state of Virginia, USA, decided to enter Virginia Commonwealth University. This educational institution, located in the state capital of Richmond, was famous for its first-class infrastructure and vibrant nightlife that revolved around the student body. The university, known for its achievements in the field of biotechnology, had about 30,000 students. For Taylor, the university's location was ideal, as it allowed her not to move too far away from her caring mother. Initially, the girl often traveled between the two cities, living for some time in Richmond with close friends of her parents. But later, she decided to settle directly on the university campus. On September 5, 2005, Taylor Bell intended to visit one of the local restaurants to have dinner with her friend Ben. After the meal, the student planned to skateboard with him through the city streets at night and then return to campus. That same morning, Taylor met with Ben to borrow his skateboard for a while, intending to return it in the evening. Around 10 in the evening, after meeting her friend, the girl came to the dormitory. However, her roommate was spending time with her boyfriend and asked Taylor not to disturb them. The girl agreed to leave, taking only her car keys, cell phone, and $40 in cash. Her purse was left in the room. Before leaving, the heroine told her roommate that she would return in a couple of hours. Contrary to her promise, Taylor did not appear in the dormitory either at the specified time or even the next day. The girl stopped communicating, did not respond on social networks, behaved very atypically for herself. Attempts to call her turned out to be futile, and all text messages sent through messengers remained unread. On September 7, 2005, the girl's mother went to the police with a statement about her daughter's disappearance. Law enforcement officers treated this without much enthusiasm, believing that the adult girl had just gone out somewhere and would soon return on her own. After all, students disappear almost every day, but in 99% of cases, such stories end with the favorable return of young people. Guys and girls can disappear for several days or more, spending time at parties with friends. A week had passed since Taylor's disappearance, and the police officers had not found out anything. Under pressure from the missing girl's relatives, the officers finally took the case seriously. They checked Taylor's activity on social networks and on her mobile phone, but found that the girl had completely stopped using them. This convinced law enforcement that the family was telling the truth, that something bad had happened to Taylor. Moreover, all the girl's things, including clothes, cosmetics, money, and a purse, were left in the dorm room. Taylor had never been out for long without these things before. In addition, no transfers or payments were recorded on her bank cards, which finally convinced the detectives of the seriousness of the situation. The police turned to the public for help through the media, but unfortunately this did not yield any results. Soon, Taylor's car was found, a white 1997 Ford Escort. It was parked just a few kilometers from the university campus. Law enforcement decided to put the car under surveillance for at least 12 hours, hoping that the likely criminal would return to it. Unfortunately, this did not happen, so the car was sent for examination. Taylor had no idea that her disappearance would become a real nightmare for the police, and especially for her loved ones. At the initial stage of the investigation, the detectives came across the first alarming find. It turned out that license plates stolen 2 months before the girl's disappearance were installed on Taylor's car. This suggested the involvement of a quick-witted and knowledgeable criminal in the case. As it became known, the numbers were registered in the state of Ohio. Investigators found that they belonged to a former resident of that state who had recently moved to Richmond. The owner of the numbers turned out to be a student who had previously reported their theft to the police. His words were confirmed, so suspicions were removed from him. In fact, such a trick was not something extraordinary, because some criminals resort to such tricks in order to confuse the trail and gain extra time. To obtain more information, experts from various fields were involved in the inspection of Taylor's vehicle. However, despite a thorough examination, this did not yield any results. Analyzing the missing girl's social circle, investigators immediately drew attention to a 38-year-old amateur photographer named Ben Foley, with whom Taylor was friends and met shortly before her disappearance. The man had no alibi for that evening. His testimony was confused and contradictory. He could not clearly explain where exactly he spent the night after Taylor's disappearance.
Ben's apartment was of particular interest to detectives. They obtained search warrants for his home, as well as the room on campus that the missing girl shared with her roommate. The man immediately got on the list of suspects, because after questioning, investigators concluded that there was an intimate relationship between him and Taylor, and that he was clearly hiding something. During a check of Ben's computer, shocking facts were discovered. It turned out that the man owned several sites where he posted quite specific content. On one of these resources, he published photos of naked and half-naked girls, and all of them were much younger than him. Some of them were minors. There were even pictures of very young children aged 3-4 years. The missing girl also posed for Ben. Taylor's mother was convinced that the photographer was using her daughter's photos illegally. In addition to these dubious activities, Ben had a criminal history related to stalking and domestic violence. Immediately after the start of the investigation, it was noticed that the man began to hastily delete his sites, probably trying to hide something from the police. He even sent a message to his subscribers about the need for an urgent cleaning. It should be noted that Taylor lived in the early 2000s, when young people were just beginning to actively use the internet. It was all new. Previously, in order to find out something about a person's identity, it was necessary to communicate with them personally or with their immediate environment for a long time. However, the example of Taylor and Ben clearly demonstrated to detectives how easy it is to obtain valuable information about a person from social networks. Studying the girl's digital footprint on the internet, the police paid attention to her profile on the suspect's website. Here, Taylor appeared completely different than in real life. Instead of a self-confident, sociable, and active girl, she seemed a frightened and withdrawn person. Judging by the restrained description in the profile, she was looking for new acquaintances in Richmond, since she had recently moved and did not know many people in this city yet. Investigators managed to find out that Taylor last logged into this site on September 4, 2005, less than a day before her disappearance. That day, the girl actively corresponded with several friends. Basically, these were light, easy conversations with jokes. Already after Taylor disappeared and people began to worry about her, a huge number of messages with words of love and support were sent to her address. Numerous friends of the girl by correspondence sincerely wished that she would return home as soon as possible, safe and sound. They did not even suspect what the heroine of this story really had to go through. Police uncovered the main suspect's dark secrets step by step, and there turned out to be quite a few of them. Having analyzed the history of correspondence over the past few months, the detectives concluded that most of Taylor's online communication
consisted of dialogues with Ben. As it turned out, very frank conversations took place between them,
from which it followed that the couple had an intimate relationship once, and this happened even before the girl moved to the campus in Richmond. The missing girl's friend reported that after intimacy with Ben, Taylor no longer wanted to maintain an intimate relationship with him, but continued to communicate as a friend. Also, police officers noticed that after the start of the investigation, Ben began to hastily delete and edit his messages, which only increased their suspicions that the man had something to hide. The relationship between Ben and Taylor also included shooting explicit photos. Even before moving to Richmond, the girl repeatedly visited Ben. For meetings, they chose unusual locations, for example, abandoned old buildings. Of course, this is not the best place for dates, but Ben insisted on such conditions for creating explicit shots. He believed that the gloomy atmosphere was ideal for the embodiment of his ideas, and he considered his work as works of art. In many messages, the name of the couple's favorite place was mentioned, Belle Isle, located on the James River in the very heart of the city. Analyzing the correspondence, the investigators concluded that Taylor herself, despite her young age, took the initiative in the relationship with Ben. At the same time, the police suggested that an adult man still had some influence on the girl, because the age difference was a whole 20 years. Taylor herself, in her messages, called this difference life experience and did not see anything wrong with it. An important role in the investigation was played by Taylor's personal diaries, which the detectives managed to find. These records reflected the typical experiences of a teenager who had already left childhood but had not yet reached full maturity. Here were doubts, fears, anxieties, and thoughts that the girl could not share with anyone. For his part, Ben was known for his attraction to very young girls. All these facts, together with the history of violations of the law, played against him. Of course, Taylor, being a student, did not suspect that Ben was publishing explicit photos in which she posed on the internet. The girl sincerely believed that they were doing art solely for themselves, and no outsiders would see these pictures. According to investigators, she became another victim of the alleged criminal. From the pages of the diary, the police learned that Taylor met with different men, preferring those older than herself. Her idol was actor Johnny Depp, whose features she subconsciously sought in every adult acquaintance. Many believed that Ben outwardly resembled a celebrity. Perhaps this is what attracted the girl to him. At that time, there was no information about Taylor's fate. Detectives continued to question her inner circle. The parents told the investigators the story of their daughter's life. For some time, the family lived in Great Britain and Belgium, often moving from place to place, since the girl's mother was married to an officer of the Royal Air Force. After the breakup of that marriage, the mother and daughter were able to return to their native Virginia. The woman got married several more times, but these attempts also turned out to be unsuccessful. Taylor was a very energetic girl with a compliant character, very smart, sometimes even too much for her age. These traits helped her quickly adapt to new schools. In total, young Taylor changed about 15 educational institutions before receiving a certificate and entering university. Everywhere, she easily made friends and made acquaintances. Sometimes the girl seemed too soft and trusting. For a long time, the mother tried to protect her daughter, believing that she was not yet ready for an independent adult life. The biography of the missing girl turned out to be full of ambiguous facts and secrets. The mother described Taylor as a willful and energetic girl. She grew up in a privileged environment surrounded by conservative and wealthy people. However, Taylor wanted to know the other side of life too, so after entering university, she decided to move to another city and settle on campus in order to achieve her goals on her own. Unfortunately, the young student did not even realize the dangers that could lurk behind the walls of a student dormitory. Despite good intentions, such places also have a dark side. Sometimes they turn into a real hotbed of undesirable phenomena among young people. Theft, substance abuse, promiscuous sexual relations. Since students are in close contact with each other, all this begins to manifest itself more clearly. At the same time, the vast majority of dorm residents are really focused on studying and getting an education. Without a wealth of life experience, it is very difficult to objectively assess the situation, which is what happened to Taylor. In the opinion of law enforcement officers, the missing girl made several serious mistakes at once. First of all, this concerns the relationship with a man who was twice her age, had convictions and mental health problems. A former girlfriend and a former roommate confirmed that Ben suffered from bipolar disorder, had sharp mood swings, and problems with anger control. In addition, detectives considered Taylor's decision to leave campus after 10 in the evening fatal. No one accompanied her, and she simply disappeared in the dark. And what is your opinion on this? Write in the comments, I will be interested to read. Investigators began compiling lists of dormitory neighbors who aroused suspicion. Police officers identified several students who were actively involved in the distribution of narcotic substances on campus. However, their alibi was confirmed. The mother of the missing girl suggested that the attack on Taylor could have been committed by several attackers. However, the most suspicious figure in this story remained 38-year-old Ben Foley, and detectives continued to closely investigate his identity. The man led a very active life on the internet. He owned several websites on various topics and revealed a lot of information about himself. Ben's subscribers even knew his shoe size, but compared to some of his thematic resources, this data seemed like a trifle. One of the most creepy turned out to be a site where a man published his distorted vision of beauty. He considered it creativity, but to detectives it seemed evidence of serious mental problems. On this resource, Ben combined images of naked bodies of models much younger than him with images of death, decaying flesh, and gothic motives. He often used real animal bones and skulls in his work. As it turned out, Ben managed to intrigue the 17-year-old student with his gloomy creativity. This is where their relationship began. It became known that before disappearing, Taylor felt lonely. In her notes, the girl admitted that she missed her friends who remained in her hometown. She had close friends and comrades, and in Richmond she had not yet managed to make enough acquaintances. Probably, that's why she communicated with the eccentric Ben. Of course, a passion for creepy images in itself did not make him a kidnapper, rapist, or murderer. But in combination with other facts of the man's biography, it caused more and more serious concerns. Studying Ben's online activity, police noticed that he displayed two completely different personalities. On the one hand, he appeared as a kind, loving, vulnerable, and creative person. On the other hand, numerous ex-girlfriends who posed for his photographs complained about him. Several former passions claimed that Ben was jealous, cruel, aggressive, and dangerous. Some girls even became victims of physical violence at his hands, although these episodes were too insignificant to report to the police. Instead, they simply broke off relations with the man after the first manifestations of aggression. But could an inexperienced 17-year-old student react incorrectly to such behavior and provoke an outburst of anger that led to murder? Suspicions about Ben Foley grew, but direct evidence was still lacking. Suddenly, on September 23, 2005, a new post appeared on Taylor's social media page. At 11:24 a.m., a message was published in which the girl claimed that she was fine and would soon return to her family. She mentioned some problems that needed to be urgently resolved, but did not go into details. Taylor's page gained considerable popularity after her disappearance and was under the close attention of many people. Therefore, the news of this post instantly spread around the city. However, the police considered the post an attempt at staging, as no one had yet managed to contact Taylor. Law enforcement officers did not believe that this message was written by the girl herself. On the same day that the new post appeared, the main suspect, Ben Foley, was arrested on charges of creating and storing pornographic materials involving minors. But the man insisted that none of the photographs found in his apartment belonged to him. According to him, these pictures were left by the previous tenant of the dwelling. At this stage of the investigation, the police had not yet charged Ben with official charges of involvement in Taylor's disappearance. In fact, he was not the only suspect in this case, but he certainly turned out to be the most colorful figure on the list. Given the time that had passed, the likelihood that the girl was still alive was extremely low. However, the investigators did not yet have convincing evidence against Foley. In any case, the trial regarding the obscene photos gave the detectives extra time to work while the suspect was behind bars. Meanwhile, the police came across a strange post by Ben published on September 8th. According to his story, he was attacked that evening. The man even had to file a report about this with the police. In one of his blogs, he described this incident in detail. According to Ben, 3 or 4 attackers attacked him. They immediately put a black bag over his head so he could not see their faces. Foley got away without serious injuries, but the attackers threw him out of the car somewhere on the outskirts of the city in the morning. They stole $20 from him, a camera, and a tripod. The man had to walk to the city for a long time. However, during searches in his house, investigators found several expensive tripods and professional filming equipment at once. Such a variety of equipment looked suspicious, because officially Ben did not work anywhere and lived on disability benefits due to bipolar disorder. The main suspect definitely could not afford such expensive purchases while receiving only state payments. Investigators intensified their efforts, trying to gather as much evidence as possible during a search of Foley's home. They managed to find several boxes with provocative items, from cold weapons, such as a huge machete, to sadomasochistic paraphernalia. Of course, the man claimed that all this was a prop for photo shoots. In addition, a suspicious stain resembling blood was found in Ben's house. Samples were sent for analysis. After the publication in the media of information about the seized items, suspicions about the amateur photographer with eccentric artistic views only intensified. Interestingly, the bloodstain was found on the man's bed spring frame.
Experienced police officers immediately asked themselves the question, how much blood would have to be shed for it to soak through the mattress and reach the springs? During searches of the area around Foley's house, several strange items were found in a dumpster, including a necklace and a watch. Clearly not the kind of accessories that people usually just get rid of. The police were also puzzled by the huge machete found in Ben's home. However, according to his statements, it served as a prop for photo shoots. In addition, the machete allegedly helped him make his way through dense thickets on the way to abandoned buildings and chop wood for a fire. In fact, the police had at least one more suspect named Jesse Schultz, whom they also thoroughly checked. It turned out that this was a 22-year-old student whose trail was managed to be found with the help of service dogs. When Taylor's car was found, specially trained dogs were used to search for the alleged criminal's scent traces. In the end, the scent trail led to the house where this young man lived. According to Jesse's confession, he began dating Taylor in August 2005. It was during this period, almost immediately after the girl moved to Richmond, that alarming entries appeared in her diaries. The Schultz family turned out to be the same friends of Taylor's father with whom she lived in the first days after arriving in the city. Despite all the efforts of the investigators, the truth about what happened to Taylor turned out to be much more terrible than they could have imagined. Taylor immediately began to complain about the son of the Schultz couple. According to the girl, the young man was so intrusive in his courtship of her that she no longer felt safe under their roof. This is what caused her to move to the university campus. However, Taylor did not mention that they were dating. After the service dogs picked up the trail that led to Jesse, law enforcement officers conducted thorough searches in his home. Traces of narcotic substances were found in the guy's room, which gave grounds for his detention. However, no concrete evidence of Jesse's involvement in Taylor's disappearance was found. In addition, he had a reliable alibi, so his name was soon crossed off the list of suspects. On October 5, 2005, investigators spoke with one of the missing girl's friends named Kevin. Despite the fact that they only met 4 times in total, this was enough for Kevin to give the impression of Taylor as an extremely trusting person. In addition, in his opinion, the girl was quite pliable and easily influenced by others. The last time they saw Taylor was the day before her disappearance. At that time, the girl seemed very inspired and excited. On the eve of her 18th birthday, she confessed to Kevin that she was going to do something risky, but did not specify what she meant. The guy suggested that it was about some kind of photo shoot. Already post factum, Kevin found out about Taylor's disappearance. On the same day, he turned to the police to tell about the recent events in the girl's life that he had to witness. In particular, it was during that meeting that he first saw Ben Foley, whom Taylor introduced as her photographer friend. Kevin immediately felt hostility towards this man because he made a very suspicious impression on him. Later, Ben himself contacted Kevin, trying to find Taylor, because he could not do it on his own. The guy had a clear feeling that the photographer was hiding something. Throughout October, the search for the missing girl continued. Police officers examined numerous locations in the vicinity of Richmond. These were places that Ben photographed as part of his project dedicated to highlighting the city's problems. One of these objects even had a separate blog of the man dedicated to it. About 100 kilometers from Richmond, in Matthews County, the body of a young woman was found in a shallow pit. It was impossible to identify her on the spot due to significant damage. The body was in a terrible condition, The soft tissues had significantly decomposed due to environmental influences and the activity of small animals like wild dogs. It was a horrifying sight, and one of the forensic experts literally could not stop his mouth from gagging at what he saw. Identification of the deceased's identity became possible only thanks to the recognition of fragments of clothing by her mother. In the end, the examination finally confirmed that the found remains belonged to the missing Taylor Bell. The woman was devastated by grief and vowed to make every effort to punish the monster who committed this terrible crime against her daughter. The place where the body was found was established, thanks to photographs taken by Ben. The attention of law enforcement officers was attracted by one of the locations that the man had been excessively interested in recently.
It was decided to carefully examine the outbuildings located there, which brought results. The body of the deceased was found behind one of the barns on private property. Experts found that soil particles from the tires of Taylor's car were identical to soil samples taken near the barn. This indicated that the criminal had transported the body in the girl's car and then drove the car to another location. Most likely, Taylor was attacked almost immediately after she left the campus. It took no more than a few hours before she was dead. Fragments of duct tape were found on the remains of the body, suggesting that the girl was held tied up. Police turned to Ben Foley for comment. He claimed that the abduction was planned and carried out by his ex-girlfriend with the participation of several beefy young men. He himself was allegedly under the influence of drugs, did not directly participate in this madness, and does not remember anything. However, this testimony sounded extremely unconvincing. After confirmation of the worst fears, Taylor's family was waiting for only one thing: justice. After the discovery of the body, all the attention of the local community was riveted to the person of the eccentric amateur photographer. The fact is that Taylor's remains were found near Chesapeake Bay, in an area that had repeatedly appeared in Ben's photographs. This indicated that for a man, this location had a special, perhaps even sacred meaning. The version of a random coincidence was immediately rejected, because Foley was the last to see the girl alive on that fatal evening. In addition, he was previously noticed in such a strange activity as collecting car license plates. Creepy details from Ben's past surfaced. In particular, an incident when he attacked his ex-girlfriend with such rage that the poor girl managed to say goodbye to life. After that attack, the defendant even inflicted bodily injuries on himself. The conflict reached such a serious scale that the girl, miraculously saved, was forced to take a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend. An internet investigation revealed a whole series of similar cases of Ben's inappropriate behavior towards his passions. Gradually, the level of aggression in his actions only increased. All these facts formed in the eyes of detectives the image of a mentally unstable man with deviant tendencies who lured young, trusting girls into his networks. On January 17, 2006, Ben Foley was officially charged with the abduction, rape, and willful murder of Taylor Bell. Unfortunately, due to the extremely poor preservation of the body, forensic experts were never able to accurately determine all the circumstances of the girl's death. This led to the fact that already in February, serious amendments had to be made to the initial charges. At that time, the suspect was already serving a sentence for storing pornographic materials depicting minors. In the end, in August, Ben made a deal with the investigation and pleaded guilty to the crimes he was charged with, albeit very selectively choosing the wording. According to his version of events, that evening, he met with Taylor immediately after she left the campus. Together, they went to a deserted place, where in the back seat of the car, Ben allegedly tied the girl's hands behind her back with duct tape, after which they had rough consensual sex. Then, in a fit of passion, the man allegedly accidentally strangled his partner. He left the body in the forest, and the next day he returned to hide the remains. Most of the facts cited by Ben remained unsubstantiated allegations that are difficult to prove. Although the forensic expert was unable to unequivocally determine the cause of Taylor's death, he insisted on its violent nature. After all, even with accidental strangulation, it takes effort for several minutes for a lethal result to occur. So the attacker could have released the victim at any time. The prosecution insisted that Ben deliberately tied the girl's wrists, not for sexual games, but to deprive her of the opportunity to resist. And this meant that the whole story he voiced was a complete lie and the events unfolded in a completely different way. Foley stood his ground, assuring that the duct tape was part of a role-playing game. However,
No one believed this version. Taylor's friends stated that she was never interested in extreme sexual practices such as asphyxia or bondage. While recreating the picture of events described by the accused, the investigators came to an unambiguous conclusion that the scenario he voiced does not stand up to any criticism. In the cramped space of a car, and even with her hands tied behind her back, the girl would be in an extremely uncomfortable and vulnerable position. Taking into account Taylor's character and habits, it is unlikely that she would voluntarily agree to this. A much more plausible version looked like Ben kidnapped, raped, and then killed his victim. The main motive for the crime was considered the girl's refusal to have an intimate relationship with Folly. During the court session, the prosecutor read out a letter that the defendant sent to his ex-girlfriend. It contained the following lines: "I am the cause of Taylor's death. I deserve imprisonment." These words could well be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Ben decided to make a deal with the prosecution and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The rest of the charges against him were dropped. In February 2006, the hapless photographer was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Taylor's mother was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Now the woman knew that the soul killer who took the life of her only daughter had been justly punished. The events of December 29, 2017, which took place in an apartment on McMillan Drive in Oshawa, Ontario, Canada. The caller, a plumber named Sean Ferridan, made a chilling discovery: pieces of human flesh clogging the sewer pipes. Further investigation led law enforcement to the doorstep of 45-year-old Adam Strong, who lived in the apartment below. To everyone's great surprise, Strong immediately confessed that he was storing human remains in his freezer. But this was just the tip of the iceberg in this complex and horrifying story. The roots of this tragedy run much deeper and require careful examination to determine to whom these remains belonged and how they ended up in the bathroom sewer. The year 2017 brought a horrific crime to the city of Oshawa that shook the entire country. On September 11th, a disturbing discovery was made in Lake Ontario near the shore of Oshawa. A 5-year-old boy fishing with his grandfather spotted human torsos in the water. Law enforcement immediately arrived at the scene, retrieved the remains from the water, and launched an investigation. Despite extensive searches involving divers, no other body parts were found. The autopsies showed that the torsos belonged to a woman, but the exact cause of death could not be determined. However, the nature of the injuries indicated a violent death. The absence of the head made it extremely difficult to identify the victim, so DNA analysis was the only way. And only on November 9, 2017, 2 months after the terrible discovery, the bitter truth was revealed. The torsos belonged to 18-year-old Rory Hatch, a pregnant Oshawa resident who had gone missing at the end of August of the same year. Rory Hatch was born on July 9, 1999, and was the favorite of her mother, Shannon Dion. Little is known about her father, but some of the girl's relatives had a reputation for living a reckless lifestyle. Her grandfather, Bernard, a former biker, gangster, and boxer, was widely known as the founder and leader of the motorcycle club Satan's Choice. Rory's uncle, Harley, also belonged to the motorcycle club Hell's Angels. But despite these family ties, Rory's childhood was fairly quiet. She was described as a kind and smart girl. In addition to her mother, Rory had a very close relationship with her godmother and Shannon's best friend, Christy Melnick. In the lower grades, Rory excelled in her studies, and at the age of 13, she even received the prestigious title of Cadet of the Year in the local unit. But everything changed for the worse in the first year of high school, when someone introduced her to drugs, which led to addiction. The next years of Rory's life were filled with turbulence, and drugs became an integral part of her existence. In an attempt to finance her addiction, she resorted to prostitution, causing even more suffering for her mother. Shannon, in desperation, turned to Child Protective Services for help, hoping to save her daughter. Fortunately, in early 2017, Shannon's efforts paid off. Rory finally began to take steps to change her life. She found a job, returned to school, and seemed to find stability by moving in with her boyfriend, Tony. Despite all the hardships, Rory was determined to start a new chapter in her life. In August 2017, Rory told her mother about her pregnancy. She firmly decided to have the baby, and Shannon supported her decision. But the mother had no idea that her daughter had started using drugs again. On August 28th, near the shopping center, Rory met with Constable Christopher Kane.
He had been watching the girl for a long time and was trying in every way to involve social services to help her overcome her addiction. During the conversation, Rory admitted that she was using drugs again and was engaged in prostitution to get money for a fix. Concerned about Rory's fate, Constable Kane decided to contact the appropriate services, but when he returned, the girl had already disappeared. On August 29, 2017, the day after meeting with the constable, a friend of her mother brought Rory to the hospital after an exacerbation of a mental disorder. Unfortunately, for unknown reasons, they were unable to stay with her and left after a few minutes, leaving Rory alone. Remarkably, just 15 minutes later, she decided to leave the hospital without waiting for the necessary medical care. Surveillance cameras captured Rory calmly leaving the building. This was the last confirmation that the girl was still alive. From that moment on, nothing was known about her whereabouts. When Rory's relatives and friends did not receive any news from her for several days, they became alarmed. Fearing the worst, they filed a missing person report with the police, which launched a massive search. Flyers with the photo of the missing person were posted all over the area, but all efforts to find Rory Hatch proved futile, and only the results of the DNA test brought the horrible news, confirming that she had become a victim of a violent crime. However, the investigation did not end there. Law enforcement faced a difficult task to find the rest of her body parts and piece together all the fragments of this tragic puzzle. And it seemed that success was near, but it came so unexpectedly that it exceeded all expectations. 2 months after the gruesome torso discovery, residents of the upstairs apartment at 19 McMillan Drive experienced persistent sewage problems. The situation escalated to the point where the couple had to call a plumber on December 29th. Since no blockages were found in the upper apartment, the workers asked permission to enter the apartment of 45-year-old Adam Strong, located on the floor below. When the plumber started working in his toilet, the air filled with an unbearable stench, different from the usual smells. The situation further escalated when Adam's behavior became nervous. He constantly walked around the room, closely monitoring every move and asking many questions. Despite being annoyed by his behavior, the plumbers tried to ignore it. Strong justified himself by saying that he was just curious because he himself had tried to cope with the problem, but to no avail. Perhaps they would have completely ignored Adam if it were not for the shocking discovery inside the pipe. The workers pulled out a 45-centimeter piece of human flesh with attached hair. To their horror, stunned by the gruesome discovery, they immediately notified the police. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived at the scene and confirmed that what was found was indeed human remains. After gathering all the necessary information from the plumbers and the alarmed couple, the officers began a conversation with Adam Strong, preparing for unexpected revelations. But nothing could have prepared them for what the suspect told them. Lowering his head, he confessed that it was human flesh, and if they needed the rest of the body parts, they were in his freezer. Strong was instantly arrested, and the police began searching the apartment. What they saw resembled a house of horrors, dirt everywhere, and the air was permeated with an unbearable stench of decay. In the bathroom, it turned out that Adam had dismantled the toilet, trying to eliminate the blockage. But the real horror awaited law enforcement. In the bedroom in the freezer lay the remains of a young woman with her head hidden in a bag. The body was in a state of decomposition, as Strong had said. Among the remains, a tattoo with the inscription "Je vis I live" was found exactly the same as Rory Hatch had. Further DNA examination confirmed that the remains from Adam Strong's apartment belonged to the missing Rory. There was more than enough evidence of her presence there. The girl's blood was found on the walls and ceiling of Adam's bedroom, and his biological fluids were found on her underwear. Rory's sneakers lay wrapped in plastic, spattered with blood. Police also discovered an improvised dissection table set up by Strong. The realization that it was on this table that Adam dismembered his victim made law enforcement officers shudder. During the search of the apartment, numerous sex toys, restraints, and a homemade bomb were also found. Fortunately, the explosives were neutralized in time, and although no one could figure out its origin, due to the lack of direct evidence of Strong's involvement in Rory's murder, the police could not charge him. Instead, he was charged with abusing the body. It was time for the investigation to get to know the life of this 45-year-old man more closely. Adam Strong, about whom little was known, settled in a rented apartment on McMillan in early 2007. For many years, he worked as a security guard on a film set in Oshawa and as a gas station attendant at 2 different stations in Ajax. Those who knew Strong described him as an eccentric man with a sinister character who considered himself smarter than he actually was. He could talk incessantly, not knowing when to stop. One of Adam's ex-girlfriends, whose name has not been disclosed, described him as cruel and prone to excessive control. Adam's landlady, Eugenia Papadakis, also had unpleasant impressions from communicating with Strong. In March 2017, after a fire in the house, she and her granddaughter visited Adam's apartment on McMillan Drive. The dwelling turned out to be cluttered with garbage, food scraps, and all sorts of junk. Needless to say, what they saw stunned the women. In addition, Strong showed an unhealthy interest in pornography, which indicated his passion for explicit content. These observations allowed a deeper look into his psyche and shed light on the dark, disturbing world that reigned in the suspect's apartment. However, despite the tragic circumstances, the evidence gathered was still insufficient to charge him with murder. So the detectives focused on obtaining a confession from Adam Strong. The morning of December 30th, 2017 was marked by the interrogation of Adam Strong, conducted by detectives from the Homicide Investigation Unit, Darren Short and Herman Daroga. By that time, the suspect had already managed to contact his lawyer. The investigators realized that this was their only chance to get valuable testimony from him, because the next day, there was to be a hearing on the possibility of releasing Strong on bail. After that, it would be impossible to interrogate him without a court order. Time was running out, so the detectives had to get important information from Adam by any means necessary. Starting the interrogation, the investigators had no clear idea what to expect. Deep down, they hoped that Strong would be nervous, because he had finally been caught.
So Adam, my name is Detective Short.
Hello, Detective.
My first name is Darren. This is Detective Drago. And what's your name?
Adam.
Last name?
Strong.
Strong, okay. As of right now, what I want to tell you is the charge you're going to be facing right now is indignity to a body.
Instead, they were faced with an imperturbable, collected man who showed outright indifference to his situation. But the biggest problem was getting him to talk about the events related to Rory Hatch. Adam's stubbornness was surprising, especially considering his previous confession about human remains in the freezer. Realizing that time was running out, the detectives decided to change tactics. They tried to touch Strong's emotions, hoping to awaken at least a drop of remorse or sympathy for the victim and her loved ones. However, all attempts by investigators to get the desired answers were shattered against a wall of evasions and changes of subject.
How did you know Rory?
I'm not saying anything, I'm sorry.
Did you kill Rory?
Sorry, I'm not saying anything.
Adam's responses were shocking, but the only thing that seemed to affect him were photos of Rory, which he refused to look at. It was obvious that the suspect could no longer bear her gaze, and although the evidence gathered was quite enough to prove Rory Hatch's presence in Adam's apartment, the ultimate goal of the detectives was to
Uncover the truth about what happened and what led to the girl's tragic death. Unfortunately, Strong proved to be a tough nut to crack. No answers to questions about Rory. 2 hours later, it became obvious that the interrogation had reached a dead end. Adam's refusal to provide anything substantial raised more questions than answers. Having failed to succeed, the investigators reluctantly decided to stop the interrogation. What exactly brought Rory Hatch and Adam Strong together remained a mystery. Fortunately for the detectives, the suspect was not released on bail, so he remained in custody. Meanwhile, Oshawa police continued to search Adam's house, hoping to stumble upon new evidence and clues. The coroner's report on Rory's autopsy shed some light on the circumstances. It turned out that the girl's body had numerous injuries, including skull fractures. However, the forensic expert could not say with certainty whether these injuries were inflicted before or after her death. In addition, traces of drugs were found in the victim's body, and signs of the use of a restraining device were found on the body. Among the findings in Strong's house, the detective's attention was drawn to a bent hammer on which Rory's DNA was found. Investigators suggested that it was the murder weapon. However, even this was not the most shocking discovery, even when it seemed that nothing more would be found. In July 2018, 7 months after Adam's arrest, a hunting knife covered in human tissue was found in a kitchen drawer. Examination showed that the DNA found on the blade did not belong to Rory. Instead, it matched the genetic profile of another girl, Candace Fitzpatrick. Candace was born on February 3, 1989, and little is known about her childhood. The girl's parents, William Fitzpatrick, and a woman whose name has not been disclosed, divorced. After that, William moved to Alberta, and Candace stayed with her mother in Oshawa. Her life was chaotic and disorderly. At some point, she ran away from home, forcing her father to go looking for her in Oshawa. After reuniting, Candace declared her desire to live independently. And by the age of 19 in 2008, her life had turned into complete disorder. Like Rory, Candace was a troubled girl who struggled with drug addiction and engaged in prostitution to get money for her next fix. She could disappear from home for days or weeks at a time, but always returned. Until March 2008, from then on, her relatives never saw her alive again. William, growing increasingly worried about his daughter, launched a massive search throughout Oshawa. Oddly enough, an official missing person report for Candace was only filed with the police in 2010, 2 years after her disappearance. William reported that back in 2008, he had repeatedly contacted law enforcement, but they did not take the case seriously due to the peculiarities of Candace's lifestyle. 10 long years of painful uncertainty passed before the Fitzpatrick family finally learned the terrible truth they had long feared. The shocking coincidences between the fates of Candace and Rory were not limited to difficult life circumstances alone. Even outwardly, the girls were strikingly similar. The cruel irony of fate is that despite the 10-year difference in their disappearances, both died at the hands of the same person. It is unbearable to realize that if Adam had been exposed after Candace's murder, Rory could have been alive. The remains of Candace Fitzpatrick still have not been found, and the solution to this chilling mystery is known only to one person. Investigators managed to convince the prosecutor to drop the initial charge against Adam Strong and reclassify it as a charge of first-degree murder of Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick. This gave detectives the opportunity to interrogate the suspect again. Realizing the importance and complexity of the case, the Oshawa police leadership involved Detective Paul Mitten in the investigation, a highly qualified and experienced investigator, known for his ability to unravel the most complicated crimes. On November 18, 2018, 11 months after the first interrogation, Adam Strong again found himself face-to-face with the investigation. This interrogation was to be decisive. To the surprise of Detective Paul Mitten, the suspect suddenly began voluntarily sharing information.
Adam!
How you doing?
Good, you?
Had better days.
Oh.
I understand I'm in a lot of trouble. Is there any way I can get a cigarette?
What are you gonna hanker him for?
Wendy's triple,
Yeah, that's doable.
no pickles, iced tea, no ice. 2, their value, spicy chicken wraps, and a grilled chicken Caesar salad.
Okay.
Is that outrageous?
No, that's doable.
I don't know how appropriate this is, but I'd like you to pass on to her mother and her father my condolences. I would like to, and I've fielded this to my lawyer, and he's not interested in it, and I don't understand why, of spilling the beans and being as comfortable as I can in jail. Not like $100,000 like Picton, but like an allowance. I don't know. I don't know. Like internet access, like a TV. Like I don't have anybody who's gonna buy me a TV. She's definitely deceased.
Yes.
Yes.
And you clearly have said, yeah, I disposed of her.
Yes.
Yes.
Tried to. But unfortunately was foiled by inadequate plumbing.
Yep.
And that's a freaking shame. Not for me. For me.
Yeah, for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. You sound really selfish when you say that.
Sorry. I don't expect to get out of the jail free card. I don't. I just want to be comfortable in jail, man.
Okay.
I didn't feel it. I'm really sorry.
Obviously, hours leading into a couple of days, I would imagine.
No, it was all done in one evening.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Like this was all one piece, and then this was all one piece.
I couldn't. Yeah.
Really?
Sorry, man. I don't remember.
Really?
Yeah. It wasn't important to me, man.
I hope one day the light bulb goes off for you. Not that you're find remorse, but just for you to realize you could help some people feel better.
Yeah.
Adam was convinced that their conversation would be limited exclusively to the topic of dismemberment of bodies. He did not even suspect that his own careless confessions and slips of the tongue would allow investigators to draw key conclusions about the entire chronology of events related to the horrific crimes. The interrogation lasted 10 grueling hours and ended only when Detective Mitten felt he had obtained all the necessary testimony.
Is it safe to assume as an investigator that Candace's
I can't go into
proposal
that.
was similar?
I can't go into that.
How did you meet Candace?
You know what? So long ago, I have no idea.
Do you remember if you met her like more than once, or was it just one time you met her?
Sorry, because every time she came to my house, she left my house. Under her own power.
Candace, given the fact that we're gonna assume because of tissue found on that knife,
Yeah.
the gutting knife, that came back as Candace's. Why not use that on Rory?
Didn't even think of it.
Because her DNA wasn't found.
Didn't even think of it. I'm a real bad procrastinator, and that is really a detriment to myself.
On September 28, 2020, when 12 years had passed since Candace's disappearance and 3 years since Rory's disappearance, Adam Strong appeared in court on charges of these murders. Despite numerous evidence gathered against him, he refused to plead guilty to both counts. During the trial, the prosecution presented a powerful evidence base, including stunning records of interrogations that supported their case against Adam Strong. Testimony from Petra Danchin about the violence she suffered at the hands of the defendant further strengthened the weight of the accusations. Although Adam never revealed the details of Rory's death during interrogations, prosecutors built their case based on the available facts. According to their version, Strong lured the girl to his house by promising money for intimate services. As soon as she entered, he tied her up and brutally beat her with a hammer found in his home. Horribly, at that moment there was no one on the upper floor, so no one heard the desperate cries for help. After the murder, Adam dismembered Rory's lifeless body and threw the torso into Oshawa Harbor. Geolocation data from her mobile phone confirmed that on September 4th, a week before the discovery of human remains, Strong was in that area, which only strengthened the evidence against him. Prosecutors also expressed confidence that Candace suffered the same fate at the hands of the killer, although her remains had not been found at that time. Lawyers, however, insisted on Adam's non-involvement in Rory's death, claiming that death occurred as a result of a drug overdose, and their client was only trying to get rid of the body. As for Candace, the defense claimed that there was a lack of evidence that she had died in Strong's house at all. They also emphasized the limited size of the freezer, which could hardly hold the remains of 2 victims. However, having carefully examined all the evidence presented, Judge Joseph DeLuca came to the unshakable conviction of Adam Strong's guilt. He rejected the defense's arguments and found the prosecution's evidence convincing and incriminating. Strong tried to justify his actions with the traumatic experience of his childhood. According to him, at an early age, he was subjected to a brutal attack that left an indelible imprint on his psyche. Adam even expressed sympathy for the families of the deceased, but the sincerity of these words was highly doubtful. His behavior demonstrated an alarming level of indifference, lack of remorse, and signs of a split personality. The materials presented during the trial vividly demonstrated that Adam Strong was well aware of the severity of his actions and their consequences. He acted consciously and prudently, without feeling any remorse. In fact, the defendant viewed prison as a way to escape from life's troubles. In the face of unemployment and financial hardship, he was ready to exchange his freedom for the basic benefits that imprisonment could guarantee. The court found that Rory Hatch's death occurred as a result of an attack, so Adam Strong was found guilty of first-degree murder. As for Candace Fitzpatrick, his guilt was classified as manslaughter. In May 2021, Strong was sentenced to life imprisonment. In addition, for the murder of Candace, he received an additional 80-year term, which is to be served concurrently with life imprisonment. This is the maximum punishment provided for by the country's legislation. Although nothing could bring back the dead girls, Rory and Candace relatives felt that justice had finally prevailed. In July 2021, Strong provided valuable information about the location of Candace Fitzpatrick's remains. Thanks to his testimony, on November 4th of the same year, the police found the place where, according to the criminal, he had buried the girl's body. On November 8th, law enforcement officers finally managed to find human remains. After conducting the necessary examinations, on November 13th, they were officially identified as the remains of Candace. The final identification results were announced at a press conference on February 16, 2022. What exactly made Adam Strong change his behavior and start talking remains a mystery. Some suggest that he sought notoriety through his actions. However, despite the tragic circumstances that united their fates, the families of Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick continue to support each other and together overcome the painful consequences of the horror they experienced. The cases of the murders of these girls have been solved. The victim's family was unspeakably happy after the announcement of the verdict for their daughter's killer, because they understood that he would never leave prison alive. But the investigation suspects that Adam Strong may be involved in other murders as well. In June 2022, during a search of his apartment, the police seized some physical evidence. However, the details of this finding are being kept secret while additional investigations are ongoing. Let's consider the main reasons that led to this tragedy. 1. Drug addiction. Both victims, Rory and Candace, struggled with drug addiction. This made them vulnerable and forced them to engage in risky behavior such as prostitution to finance their addiction. 2. Social isolation. Although both girls had families who cared about them, their lifestyle often led to isolation from loved ones and support. 3. Insufficient attention from law enforcement. In the case of Candace Fitzpatrick, her father's initial reports of her disappearance were not taken seriously due to her lifestyle. Now, I would like to share some important tips on how to avoid similar situations in the future. 1. Fight drug addiction. If you or someone you love is suffering from drug addiction, seek professional help immediately. There are many rehabilitation and support programs that can help overcome addiction. 2. Stay in touch with loved ones. Communicate regularly with family and friends. If you notice that someone close to you is distancing themselves or behaving unusually, don't ignore it. Offer your support and assistance. 3. Be vigilant. If you notice something suspicious in your surroundings, unusual smells, strange behavior of neighbors, don't be shy to report it to the appropriate authorities. Your vigilance can save someone's life. 4. Take disappearances seriously. If someone you know has gone missing, report it to the police immediately. Don't wait, hoping that the person will return on their own. Every hour can be crucial. 5. Teach children about safety. Talk to children about personal safety. Teach them to recognize potentially dangerous situations and people. Explain how important it is to trust their intuition and not be ashamed to ask for help. 6. Don't judge, but help. Instead of judging people for their lifestyle, try to understand their problems and offer help. Often people find themselves in difficult situations due to circumstances they cannot control. This tragic story of Rory Hatch and Candace Fitzpatrick demonstrates to us how important it is to be vigilant and caring members of society. We all have a responsibility for the safety of our community. It is important to remember that criminals like Adam Strong often look for vulnerable victims. They may seem like ordinary people, but behind this mask lie dangerous intentions. Therefore, it is critically important to learn to recognize alarming signs and not ignore them. This case also highlights the need to reform the system for responding to missing persons. Regardless of the lifestyle of the missing person, every case must be investigated with the same seriousness and thoroughness. Perhaps if the police had responded more quickly to Candace's disappearance, the tragedy with Rory could have been prevented. Remember that safety is a shared responsibility. Each of us can contribute to creating a safer society. Be attentive to your surroundings, support those who need it, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you feel that something is wrong.